Few stories in human history resonate with the power and drama of the biblical Exodus. It is a foundational narrative for billions, painting an epic canvas of divine intervention, miraculous escape, and the birth of a nation. It is the quintessential tale of liberation, hope, and God's mighty hand, deeply embedded in the American cultural imagination as a narrative of freedom and destiny. This story, passed down through generations, describes not just an event, but a profound act of divine power that shaped the very identity of a people, transforming them from enslaved foreigners into a sovereign nation. For many, it represents the ultimate triumph over oppression, a powerful testament to faith and divine justice. Yet, what if the story we know, the one etched into our collective consciousness, is profoundly different from the historical reality? What if the truth of the Exodus is far more complex, more nuanced, and perhaps more unromantic than the miracles and parting seas we envision? This series aims to delve into these very questions, to challenge the popular narratives, and to seek a deeper understanding of what may have truly transpired. Join us on History for the Tired as we embark on a courageous journey, not to discredit faith, but to illuminate history. We will rigorously examine the biblical Exodus narrative through the demanding lenses of archaeology, historical scholarship, and scientific inquiry. Our goal is to move beyond the Sunday school stories and the Hollywood epics to unearth the hard, often surprising, facts about ancient Egypt, the Sinai Desert, and the emergence of Israel in Canaan. This process requires an open mind and a willingness to confront evidence that may challenge long-held beliefs, but it promises a richer, more grounded understanding of the past. Prepare to have your assumptions challenged and your understanding deepened as we separate historical fact from theological narrative in this profound biblical story. We believe that true understanding comes from engaging with all available evidence, whether it confirms or complicates our existing narratives. So, if you're ready to explore the hidden layers of one of history's most compelling tales, be sure to follow our channel and subscribe to History for the Tired on YouTube, where we dare to uncover the real stories buried beneath the myths, always striving for truth and clarity in ancient history. The Exodus narrative, as told in the Hebrew Bible, begins with a grim backdrop: the oppression of the Israelites in Egypt after the time of Joseph, who had saved Egypt from famine and brought his family to live in the prosperous land of Goshen. The narrative states that a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. This pharaoh, strikingly, is never named in the biblical text, an anonymity that immediately raises questions for historians seeking specific historical anchors. This unnamed pharaoh becomes increasingly fearful of the burgeoning Israelite population, described as numerous and stronger than the Egyptians. His fear, fueled by xenophobia and a desire to maintain control, leads him to implement a cruel and systematic policy of forced labor. The Israelites are compelled to endure brutal conditions, forced to build store cities, Pithom and Ramses, massive urban centers designed to serve the pharaoh's grand ambitions and consolidate his power. This initial phase of oppression describes a gradual tightening of the chains, as the Egyptians sought to break the spirit and control the growth of this foreign people in their midst. The severity of their servitude is consistently emphasized, painting a picture of relentless toil and dehumanizing treatment, designed to break the will of a people and prevent any potential uprising, a key element in understanding the context of the biblical story of slavery. As the biblical narrative continues, the pharaoh's fear escalates into a policy of horrifying cruelty, a genocidal decree to cast all newborn Israelite boys into the Nile River. This chilling command reflects the pharaoh's desperation to control the Israelite population, viewing their increasing numbers as an existential threat to his kingdom. It reveals the depths of his tyranny and the extreme measures he was willing to take to maintain his absolute power, attempting to annihilate the very future of the Israelite people. It is into this crucible of immense suffering and existential threat that Moses is born. His birth is not just a personal event, but a pivotal moment in the narrative, shrouded in divine providence. Faced with the pharaoh's brutal decree, Moses' mother bravely defies the order, concealing him for 3 months. When she can no longer hide him, she devises a desperate plan, placing him in a papyrus basket coated with tar and pitch, and setting him adrift among the reeds of the Nile, where he is discovered by Pharaoh's own daughter. This miraculous concealment and rescue, orchestrated by divine will, immediately sets Moses apart as a figure destined for greatness, even as a helpless infant. Moses' early life, as depicted, is one of extraordinary duality, shaping him for his future role. He is brought up in Pharaoh's very household, a member of the royal court, enjoying the privileges while tending his flock on Mount Horeb. Moses encounters a bush that burns with fire but is not consumed. This is no ordinary phenomenon. It is a manifestation of God who reveals himself directly to Moses. In this sacred encounter, God commissions Moses to return to Egypt and lead his people out of bondage. Moses, however, is filled with self-doubt, protesting his inadequacy, his lack of eloquence, and questioning who he is to undertake such a monumental task against the mighty Pharaoh. He repeatedly raises objections, expressing his fear and reluctance, a very human response to a divine mandate of such immense scale. Yet, God assures him of his presence, his power, and the ultimate success of the mission, promising to be with your mouth and teach you what you are to speak. This divine assurance, coupled with the revelation of God's holy name, Yahweh, transforms Moses from a timid shepherd into the chosen instrument of divine liberation. This crucial interaction sets the stage for the dramatic confrontation that will follow, directly challenging the pharaoh's authority and education of the Egyptian elite, far removed from the toil and suffering of his Israelite kin. This upbringing would have granted him unique insights into Egyptian power, culture, and weaknesses. However, despite his privileged position, the narrative suggests he was acutely aware of his true Israelite heritage. This internal conflict reaches a breaking point when, as an adult, he witnesses an Egyptian overseer brutally beating a Hebrew slave. In a moment of righteous indignation and perhaps impulsive anger, Moses intervenes, killing the Egyptian and burying his body. This act, while fueled by justice, marks him as a fugitive, forcing him to flee Egypt and escape Pharaoh's wrath. He finds refuge in the land of Midian, far from the grandeur of Egypt, where he settles into a simpler life as a shepherd, marrying Zipporah and raising a family. This period of quiet contemplation and hardship in the wilderness serves as a crucial training ground, stripping him of his royal identity and preparing him for a deeper spiritual encounter that will ultimately transform him into the reluctant but powerful deliverer of his people, ready to face the Egyptian oppression. The pivotal moment in Moses' life, and indeed in the Exodus narrative, arrives at the burning bush. Armed with divine authority and the unwavering support of his older brother, Aaron, who serves as his eloquent spokesman. Moses confronts Pharaoh. Their demand is clear and insistent: "Let my people go." The first plague sees the Nile River turn to blood, polluting the lifeblood of Egypt, killing fish, and rendering the water undrinkable. This challenges Hapi, the god of the Nile, and other deities associated with life-giving water, signaling that even Egypt's essential source of life is under Yahweh's control. Following this, frogs infest the land, emerging from the very waters that had turned to blood, swarming into homes and beds, making life unbearable. This plague specifically targets Hecate, the goddess of fertility and childbirth, often depicted with a frog's head. Next, gnats emerge from the dust of the earth, covering both people and animals, tormenting every living being. This challenges Geb, the god of the earth, indicating that even the very dust of Egypt is subject to Yahweh's command. Finally, swarms of flies descend upon Egypt, distinct from the gnats, causing immense nuisance and suffering, yet sparing the land of Goshen, where the Israelites resided. This plague might target deities like Kamam, who created humanity from clay, or even Re, the sun god, as the flies obscure the light. Each of these initial 4 plagues systematically dismantles aspects of Egyptian life and religious belief. Yet Pharaoh's stubbornness remains unwavering, underscoring the narrative's emphasis on his hardened heart. This simple yet revolutionary plea initiates a relentless struggle of wills, a theological and political battle between the mighty God of Israel and the supposedly divine Pharaoh, the earthly embodiment of Egyptian power. Pharaoh, arrogant and secure in his own divinity and the strength of his empire, repeatedly refuses, hardening his heart against Moses' demands and the suffering of the Israelites. This refusal, meticulously detailed in the biblical narrative, sets in motion a series of increasingly devastating divine judgments, the 10 plagues. Each plague is not merely a natural disaster. It is presented as a direct challenge to a specific Egyptian deity or aspect of Egyptian cosmic order, demonstrating Yahweh's supreme power over the gods of Egypt and over creation itself. The escalating intensity and impact of these plagues serve to progressively break down Pharaoh's resistance, proving God's absolute sovereignty and the futility of human defiance against divine will, paving the way for the biblical Great Escape. The initial plagues serve as a prelude to the overwhelming power that is about to be unleashed upon Egypt. As Pharaoh continues his defiance, the plagues intensify, bringing greater devastation and suffering upon the land of Egypt. The 5th plague brings a devastating livestock disease, striking down horses, donkeys, camels, cattle, and sheep. The 8th plague is an overwhelming infestation of locusts, which descend upon the land like a dark cloud, devouring every last green thing left after the hailstorm, leaving the land utterly barren. This plague targets deities associated with harvest and sustenance, such as Senahim, the god of the granary, and Renutet, the cobra goddess of harvest. The sheer scale of destruction to Egypt's food supply would have been catastrophic. Following this, the 9th plague plunges Egypt into a suffocating darkness for 3 days, a palpable gloom that prevents anyone from seeing another or moving about. Yet light miraculously remains in the dwellings of the Israelites. This direct assault on Ra, the preeminent sun god of Egypt, is perhaps the most profound theological challenge, proving Yahweh's supremacy over the very source of light and life for the Egyptians. The land is devastated, plunged into chaos and despair, with Pharaoh's magicians and officials increasingly urging him to relent. Yet, even as the nation collapses around him, Pharaoh clings to his defiance, momentarily yielding only to harden his heart once more, setting the stage for the final, most terrifying judgment, but once again sparing the animals of the Israelites. This plague challenges various Egyptian deities associated with animal welfare and fertility, such as Apis, the sacred bull, and Nvv, another sacred bull god, demonstrating Yahweh's power over their very sustenance and wealth. This is followed by the sixth plague, boils, erupting on both humans and animals throughout Egypt, causing painful sores and agony. This targets deities associated with healing and medicine, such as Imhotep, the god of medicine, and Sekhmet, the goddess of healing and vengeance. Then comes the seventh plague, a catastrophic hailstorm of unprecedented severity, destroying crops, trees, and everything left in the fields, accompanied by fire that ran along the ground. This plague directly challenges Nut, the goddess of the sky, and Seth, the god of storms, showing Yahweh's control over the very elements, despite the mounting devastation and immense suffering of his people. Pharaoh's will remains unbroken, a testament to his hubris in the face of divine power. The narrative of the plagues builds towards an inevitable and terrifying climax, as Egypt is systematically brought to its knees. The climax of the plagues, and the turning point of the entire Exodus narrative, is the chilling death of the firstborn. This 10th and most devastating plague is a direct divine judgment upon every firstborn, male, both human and animal, throughout the land of Egypt. There is an immediate and desperate urgency to their departure. They do not even have time for their bread to rise, baking unleavened bread for their journey. The text emphasizes their sheer numbers, stating that there were 600,000 men on foot, besides women and children. This figure, when including women, children, and the mixed multitude that accompanied them, suggests a total population of 2 to 3 million people, or even more, a truly colossal number that would be larger than the entire population of Egypt at the time. Furthermore, the narrative details how the Israelites, at God's command, effectively plundered the Egyptians before their departure. They asked their Egyptian neighbors for articles of silver, gold, and clothing, and the Egyptians, desperate to be rid of them after the plagues, willingly gave them whatever they requested, thus fulfilling God's promise to Abraham that his descendants would come out with great possessions. This act of spoiling the Egyptians is presented as divine retribution and compensation for centuries of forced labor and oppression, marking their departure not as a mere escape, but as a triumphant and divinely sanctioned exit from bondage. From the firstborn of Pharaoh himself to the firstborn of the lowest servant and even the firstborn of the livestock, this plague, unlike the others, targets life itself, striking at the very heart of Egyptian families and their hopes for the future. However, for the Israelites, this night of terror becomes the night of their salvation. God provides a specific instruction. Each Israelite household must sacrifice a lamb, smear its blood on their doorposts, and eat its roasted meat with unleavened bread. When the angel of death passes through Egypt, it will pass over the homes marked with blood, sparing the Israelite firstborn. This event, forever remembered as Passover, is not just a miracle of protection, but the ultimate act of divine distinction between Israel and Egypt. establishing a foundational ritual for generations to come. This final, unbearable plague breaks Pharaoh's will completely, shattering his defiance and leaving him no choice but to finally command the Israelites to leave Egypt immediately. The cries of anguish throughout Egypt are deafening, forcing even Pharaoh to acknowledge the power of Yahweh. With Pharaoh's will finally broken by the unimaginable grief and devastation of the 10th plague, the biblical narrative describes the hasty departure of an immense multitude of Israelites from Egypt. However, the dramatic escape is immediately complicated by Pharaoh's infamous change of heart. Despite having suffered unimaginable losses and having personally ordered the Israelites' departure, the biblical narrative states that Pharaoh's heart was hardened once more, and he quickly rallied his elite forces, including his chariots, to pursue the now free Israelites. The Egyptians, no doubt enraged and humiliated by the plagues and the loss of their labor force and wealth, set out to recapture their former slaves. The Israelites, with the vast, seemingly impassable waters before them and the formidable Egyptian army closing in behind, this moment is depicted as one of ultimate desperation and panic among the Israelites, who blame Moses for leading them to their certain doom. They cry out in fear, longing for the fleshpots of Egypt, over facing immediate death. Yet, in this crucible of despair, Moses stands firm, proclaiming God's imminent salvation, assuring them that the Egyptians whom you see today you shall never see again. This sets the stage for the most iconic and dramatic miracle of the entire Exodus. In a climactic display of divine power, a powerful east wind parts the waters of the Sea of Reeds, creating a dry pathway through the very heart of the sea. Moses stretches out his hand, and the waters miraculously divide, forming towering walls on either side, allowing the immense multitude of Israelites to cross on dry ground. This unprecedented event is the ultimate testament to Yahweh's control over nature and his unwavering commitment to his people as liberation. The sight must have been utterly awe-inspiring, a moment of profound spiritual and physical deliverance. Blinded by their rage and perhaps deluded by divine intervention, the Egyptian army, with Pharaoh at its head, foolishly attempts to follow them into the seabed. However, as the Israelites safely reach the other side, the waters crash back down, engulfing the entire Egyptian army, chariots and horses, drowning every last one of them. This complete divine deliverance ensures Israel's absolute liberation, eliminating any future threat from their former oppressors. This miracle at the sea is not merely an escape, it is the definitive moment of salvation, establishing Yahweh as the supreme deity and Moses as his divinely appointed leader, forever etched in the collective memory of the biblical story of freedom. Now truly free, but facing an immense and desolate landscape, the Israelites embark on their 40-year wilderness journey through the Sinai desert. This period, far from being a triumphant march, is characterized by immense hardship and frequent challenges to their nascent faith. The immediate concerns are survival, the lack of readily available food and water in the harsh desert environment. Time and again, the Israelites begin to grumble and complain bitterly against Moses and against God, longing for the security and even the meager food of their former lives in Egypt, despite their slavery. This constant tension between divine provision and human faithlessness becomes a recurring theme throughout their wanderings. Yet, in response to their complaints, God consistently provides miraculous sustenance, manna appearing like dew each morning. a bread-like substance from heaven, and flocks of quail descending in abundance for meat. Water is provided miraculously from rocks, sustaining the vast multitude in the parched land. These miraculous provisions are constant reminders of God's faithfulness, even amidst Israel's persistent rebellions and lack of trust, showcasing the divine guidance for the biblical journey through the desert. The spiritual heart of the wilderness journey, and indeed of the entire Exodus narrative, is the arrival at Mount Sinai. Here, in a moment of profound theological significance, God descends upon the mountain in a spectacular manifestation of thunder, lightning, thick smoke, and the sound of a trumpet blast, inspiring awe and terror among the people. It is here that God reveals himself and gives Moses the 10 Commandments, a foundational moral and ethical code for all humanity, but specifically for Israel. These commandments form the core of the Mosaic covenant, an agreement between God and his newly liberated people, establishing their unique relationship and outlining their responsibilities. The giving of the law extends far beyond the 10 Commandments, encompassing an intricate legal system that governs every aspect of Israelite life. Civil laws, religious rituals, social justice, and purity laws. This comprehensive legal framework transforms a disparate collection of freed slaves into a holy nation with a unique identity and purpose. The Sinai experience solidifies their identity as a people bound to Yahweh by a divine covenant, setting them apart from all other nations and providing the framework for their future society. Following the covenant at Sinai, a significant portion of the wilderness narrative focuses on the construction and details of the tabernacle. This portable sanctuary, meticulously designed according to divine instructions given to Moses, serves as God's dwelling place among his people during their wanderings. It is a physical manifestation of God's presence, a place where atonement can be made and where the Israelites can worship him in a structured, orderly fashion. Its detailed specifications and sacred implements emphasize the importance of purity, order, and priestly service. However, even as the tabernacle is being constructed, the Israelites demonstrate a persistent tendency towards rebellion and idolatry. The infamous golden calf incident occurs early in the journey, where, impatient with Moses' prolonged absence on the mountain, the people pressure Aaron to fashion an idol for them to worship. This profound act of apostasy sparks divine wrath and underscores the deep spiritual challenges faced by a people newly liberated but not yet spiritually transformed. Later, other rebellions emerge, such as Korah's rebellion against Moses' and Aaron's divinely appointed leadership, demonstrating the continuous struggle for authority and obedience within the nascent community. These repeated acts of divine punishment, followed by Moses' intercession, highlight the difficult process of forging a nation from a multitude of individuals. A particularly pivotal and tragic moment in the wilderness journey involves the sending of spies into Canaan. From Kadesh Barnea, 12 leaders, one from each tribe, are sent to scout out the promised land, to assess its strength and its inhabitants. After 40 days, they return with a report that is both encouraging and terrifying. 10 of the spies bring back a fearful report describing the land's inhabitants as formidable giants and their cities as heavily fortified, making conquest seem impossible. Only Caleb and Joshua maintain faith in God's promise and ability to deliver the land. However, the majority report spreads panic and despair among the people, who once again choose to grumble and rebel against God and Moses. They propose appointing a new leader and returning to Egypt, rejecting the divine promise and expressing a profound lack of trust. In response to this profound act of faithlessness and disobedience, God issues a severe judgment. The entire generation of adults who left Egypt will perish in the wilderness over the course of 40 years, never entering the promised land. This long, arduous period of wandering becomes a time of purification and testing, transforming the rebellious generation into a new one, born and raised in the wilderness, who would finally be ready to inherit the promise. The relentless wilderness journey continues, marked by ongoing challenges, both from external threats and internal strife. Beyond the initial rebellions, like the golden calf and Korah's defiance, the Israelites face numerous tests of obedience and leadership. Even Moses, the great deliverer, falters at one point, striking the rock to bring forth water instead of speaking to it as commanded. This act of disobedience, seemingly minor, results in his own exclusion from entering the promised land, a harsh but consistent demonstration of divine justice. As the old generation perishes, a new one rises, hardened by the desert, shaped by the law, and prepared for the task ahead. This new generation, forged in the crucible of the wilderness, is led by Joshua, Moses' faithful and divinely appointed successor. The transition of leadership is seamless, ensuring continuity of purpose. The biblical narrative carefully details the genealogies and censuses of this new generation, highlighting their readiness for the coming challenges. They finally arrive on the plains of Moab, east of the Jordan River, looking across at the land that has been promised to them for centuries, now poised for the fulfillment of God's ancient covenant. The long journey, though filled with hardship, has ultimately transformed a rebellious band of former slaves into a disciplined nation ready to claim their inheritance. With the new generation ready and waiting on the eastern bank of the Jordan River, the book of Deuteronomy records Moses' final speeches. These are powerful, extended discourses where Moses reviews the entire history of the Exodus and the wilderness wanderings, meticulously reiterates the comprehensive Mosaic law, and warns the people about the consequences of disobedience, while promising blessings for faithfulness. He reminds them of their unique identity as a chosen people and their solemn obligations under the covenant. His words are both a farewell and a final, passionate plea for unwavering devotion to Yahweh and his commands. Moses then ascends Mount Nebo, where God shows him the entirety of the promised land from afar, a land he is destined to see but not enter. There, Moses dies and is buried in an unknown location, marking the end of an era. The narrative then immediately shifts to Joshua's leadership, emphasizing the divine continuity and God's promise to be with Joshua, just as he was with Moses. The stage is now fully set for the most dramatic and controversial phase of the Exodus saga, the direct, forceful entry and conquest of Canaan. The people, steeled by their 40 years in the wilderness and unified under a new leader, stand ready to fulfill their destiny and claim their inheritance. This understanding of the biblical text as primarily a theological and identity-shaping narrative helps us to approach its internal features, such as literary devices and apparent inconsistencies, not as errors, but as characteristics of ancient storytelling. For instance, the sheer numbers involved in the Exodus, 600,000 men on foot, besides women and children, suggesting a total population of 2 to 3 million, are widely interpreted by scholars as hyperbole. This was a common ancient literary device used to convey immense scale or divine power rather than a literal census. Ancient Near Eastern texts often used inflated figures to glorify a king's army or achievements. The very nature of how these ancient stories came to be recorded points to a long and complex process of transmission and composition. Modern biblical scholarship, particularly through the documentary hypothesis, suggests that the Pentateuch is not the work of a single author writing a continuous historical account. Instead, it is believed to be a composite work woven together over centuries from at least 4 distinct literary sources: the Yahwist, the Elahist, the Deuteronomist, and the priestly sources. Each source, identified by its unique vocabulary, style, theological perspective, and historical context, represents different traditions and perspectives on Israel's origins. For example, the J source might have an anthropomorphic depiction of God, while the E source might emphasize dreams and angels. These independent sources were later combined and edited by redactors, often during or after the Babylonian exile, to create the unified narrative we have today. This layered composition explains many of the internal inconsistencies and repetitions within the text as different traditions were brought together. It highlights that the biblical text itself is a product of historical development, reflecting evolving theological and political concerns of the communities that produced and preserved it, making it a unique and powerful biblical narrative of origins. This understanding of the layered origins of the Exodus narrative helps us to appreciate its rich literary and theological complexity. The long process of oral tradition played a crucial role in shaping these stories before they were committed to writing. For centuries, the tales of the patriarchs, the escape from Egypt, and the wilderness wanderings were passed down orally from generation to generation. Oral traditions are inherently fluid. They are shaped by retelling, emphasizing certain elements, adapting to new audiences, and often blending historical memories with legendary embellishments to serve a current purpose. To truly grasp the nature of the biblical Exodus narrative, it is enlightening to compare its style and themes with other ancient Near Eastern literary traditions. The Bible did not emerge in a vacuum. It shares common literary tropes and narrative patterns with the surrounding cultures of Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Canaan. For instance, many ancient cultures had myths of divine intervention, where powerful deities intervened in human affairs, often through spectacular natural phenomena to establish order, punish the wicked, or deliver a chosen people. The plagues, with their systematic challenge to Egyptian deities, fit within this broader regional understanding of divine power. Similarly, like almost every ancient civilization, Israel had its own foundational origin stories that explained its unique identity, its relationship with its gods, and its place in the cosmos. These stories often involved miraculous births, divine quests, epic journeys, and the establishment of laws or cities. The Exodus functions precisely as this kind of foundational origin story for Israel, explaining its very existence and raison d'etre. Furthermore, the figure of Moses, leading his people against an oppressive empire, shares common elements with heroic narratives from other ancient cultures, where a divinely chosen or exceptionally capable individual rises to deliver their people from adversity. The hero's journey archetype is deeply embedded in human storytelling across time and cultures. Even the giving of the law at Sinai has parallels with other ancient Near Eastern These ancient law codes often begin with a historical prologue detailing how the laws were divinely ordained and given to a king for the well-being of his people. This structural similarity suggests that the Sinai narrative functions as a divine charter for Israel, legitimizing its laws as coming directly from Yahweh rather than from human decree. By placing the Exodus narrative within this broader literary context, we can appreciate its unique theological message while recognizing the shared storytelling conventions of the ancient world and layered composition. How do modern scholars approach the biblical Exodus as a historical source? There are generally three broad academic approaches. The maximalist approach tends to accept the biblical narrative as largely historically accurate unless definitive archaeological or external evidence strongly contradicts it. Proponents of this view often work to harmonize archaeological findings with biblical accounts, interpreting archaeological silence as simply a lack of discovery rather than a lack of an event. Their strength lies in respecting the biblical text's own claims to historicity, but critics argue this can sometimes lead to stretching interpretations or dismissing contradictory evidence. This perspective is often favored by those who seek direct corroboration for every biblical detail. In contrast, the minimalist approach views the biblical texts primarily as theological or ideological constructs, written much later than the events they purport to describe, often reflecting the concerns of the Persian or Hellenistic periods. Proponents of this view argue that the texts contain little or no reliable historical information about the early periods, unless unequivocally corroborated by external, archaeological, or epigraphic evidence. From this perspective, the Exodus, as a grand mass migration, is largely a myth created to legitimize later Israelite identity and claims to land, while its strength lies in demanding high standards of external corroboration. Critics argue it can be overly skeptical, potentially dismissing genuine historical memories embedded within later traditions. This approach is highly critical of claims that the Bible itself serves as a historical blueprint for the earliest periods. The most common and widely accepted approach among mainstream biblical scholars and archaeologists today is the nuanced or centrist approach. This perspective acknowledges that the biblical text is a complex literary and theological document, not a modern historical report. It recognizes that the narrative likely contains kernels of historical memory, possibly of smaller scale events, broader population movements, or formative experiences. However, these historical memories have been significantly amplified, stylized, and reinterpreted for profound theological purposes over centuries of oral tradition and subsequent redaction. The methodology employed by these scholars involves a meticulous analysis of the text's literary features, a careful comparison with ancient Near Eastern parallels, and a rigorous evaluation against all available archaeological and epigraphic evidence. They seek to identify what could be historical within the narrative, while always respecting its primary theological function. This approach offers a balanced perspective, avoiding both uncritical acceptance and unwarranted dismissal of the biblical text's historical value. The strength of the nuanced approach lies in its ability to engage with the biblical text in its own terms, appreciating its spiritual and cultural significance, while simultaneously subjecting its historical claims to rigorous academic scrutiny. It is a story designed to inspire, to teach, and to define, crafted with layers of literary artistry and profound theological purpose. Its very internal complexities. The unnamed pharaoh, the impossibly large numbers, the differing accounts of conquest hint at a long process of formation, where historical memory likely intertwined with profound spiritual meaning and later theological needs. These are not errors in the text, but rather fingerprints of its ancient origins and diverse composition, reflecting centuries of oral tradition and redaction. It underscores that the truth of the Exodus is multifaceted, reaching far beyond simple historical fact. For the millions of Americans who hold this story dear, understanding these nuances allows for a richer and more informed appreciation of a text that has shaped civilizations. It allows for a richer and more profound understanding of how ancient communities constructed their foundational narratives, reflecting both their historical experiences and their deepest spiritual beliefs. This approach also avoids the false dichotomy of having to choose between faith and historical inquiry, instead fostering a dialogue between them. It recognizes that a story can be profoundly true in a theological or metaphorical sense, even if its literal historical details are not empirically verifiable. This middle ground acknowledges the human authorship and editorial processes behind the biblical text, without negating its divine inspiration or its enduring power for believers. It's about seeking the most plausible historical reconstruction given all the available evidence, recognizing that ancient texts often communicate truth through narrative and symbolism rather than strict factual reporting. In conclusion, understanding the biblical Exodus narrative begins not with a shovel, but with a careful, critical reading of the text itself. Having understood the story as presented in the Bible, and having explored the intricate ways in which it was likely composed over centuries, we must now ask a crucial question that directly impacts its historicity. What does the external historical record, specifically from the powerful and meticulously documented civilization of ancient Egypt, tell us about the existence of the Israelites within its borders and the occurrence of an event so catastrophic as the Exodus? Was ancient Egypt truly a place where millions of foreigners could be enslaved and then disappear without a trace? Or do the records of the pharaohs reveal a different picture entirely? This sets the stage for our next profound exploration as we turn our gaze to the land itself, to ancient Egypt, and to the archaeological record, to seek the echoes of this epic tale beyond the stories. We are about to delve into the very heart of the empire where the story unfolds. In our previous segment, we meticulously deconstructed the powerful narrative of the biblical Exodus, exploring its dramatic arc from Israelite oppression in Egypt to the miraculous parting of the sea and the epic journey through the wilderness. We examined the text not just as a story, but as a complex literary and theological document, understanding its purpose in shaping identity and conveying profound spiritual truths, even as it presents internal inconsistencies that challenge a strictly literal interpretation. Now, as promised, we shift our focus from the sacred text to the very stage upon which this colossal drama is said to have unfolded, ancient Egypt itself, to evaluate the historical plausibility of a mass exodus. We must first deeply understand the society from which the Israelites supposedly emerged. Our journey takes us to the New Kingdom, a period generally spanning from the 18th to the 20th dynasties, roughly from 1550 to 1070 BCE. This era represents the absolute zenith of Egyptian power and influence, a time when the land of the Nile was not merely a regional power, but a formidable empire, a true superpower that cast its long shadow across the ancient Near East, reaching deep into Nubia in the south, and exerting firm control over Canaan and Syria in the north. Understanding the internal workings of New Kingdom Egypt is absolutely critical for anyone seeking to uncover the truth behind the Exodus story, especially for our American audience interested in ancient history facts. This was an era of unparalleled wealth, military might, and grand monumental construction, all indicative of a highly centralized and meticulously organized society. The pharaohs of this period commanded immense resources, both human and material, capable of undertaking projects of staggering scale, colossal temples, sprawling new cities, and vast military campaigns that reshaped the geopolitical map, the very structure of Egyptian society. From its intricate bureaucracy of scribes and officials to its systems for mobilizing massive labor forces, suggests a level of control over its population that is hard for modern minds to fully grasp. This robust framework of governance and power would have direct implications for any large-scale population movement, whether in or out of its borders. Therefore, by immersing ourselves in the operational realities of this period, we can move beyond generalized notions of powerful pharaoh and begin to critically assess the feasibility of millions of people suddenly departing from one of the most tightly controlled empires in the ancient world, as the biblical narrative suggests. The New Kingdom was shaped by a succession of formidable pharaohs, each leaving an indelible mark on Egypt's imperial legacy. Consider Thutmose III, often lauded as the Napoleon of Egypt, whose brilliant military strategies, his reign, lasting an astonishing 66 years, was an era of unparalleled monumental construction, including the colossal temples at Abu Simbel and the extensive expansion of existing cities, as well as the founding of magnificent new ones. Most notably, he established his grand new capital, Pyramidus, in the eastern Nile Delta, a city explicitly mentioned in the biblical narrative as one built by Israelite forced labor. Ramesses II was also a formidable military leader, though his most famous encounter, the Battle of Kadesh against the Hittites, ended in a stalemate, which he nonetheless depicted as a glorious victory. His reign epitomizes the wealth and influence of Egyptian pharaohs, showcasing their unbridled ambition and their unparalleled capacity to mobilize vast resources and populations for their self-aggrandizing projects. The scale of his building endeavors, which would have required massive labor forces, directly relates to the biblical account of Israelite servitude, providing a specific context for the ancient Egyptian building projects. And numerous campaigns solidified Egyptian dominance over Canaan and Syria, creating an empire of unprecedented size. His extensive annals, carved into temple walls, meticulously detailed the vast amounts of tribute and plunder brought back to Egypt, fueling an era of immense prosperity and enabling the construction of magnificent temples and monuments. Then came Akhenaten, whose brief but revolutionary reign attempted a radical shift to monotheistic worship of the Aten, the sun disk, a testament to the pharaoh's immense, even divine authority over every aspect of life, demonstrating the potential for absolute ideological control from the throne. While his religious reforms were ultimately reversed, his ability to even attempt such a drastic change underscores the singular power held by the pharaoh. Following the turbulent Amarna period, pharaohs like Horemheb and Seti, I worked diligently to restore order, strengthen the army, and reassert traditional values, meticulously rebuilding the administrative and military structures. But perhaps the most relevant figure, often identified by scholars as the pharaoh of the Exodus due to biblical hints, is Ramesses II, often referred to as Ramesses the Great. Crucially, ancient Egypt was never an ethnically homogeneous society. It was, in many ways, a vibrant and diverse melting pot, particularly in the bustling Nile Delta region. The most significant historical precedent for a large, foreign, specifically Semitic, presence in Egypt before the New Kingdom was the period of the Hyksos. During the Second Intermediate Period, foreign rulers, primarily of Levantan Semitic origin, gained control of Lower Egypt, establishing their capital at Avaris. The Hyksos period, though relatively short-lived, fundamentally reshaped Egyptian perceptions of foreigners. They introduced new technologies, such as the composite bow and the horse-drawn chariot, which later became integral to the Egyptian military. However, their rule was deeply resented by the native Egyptians, who eventually launched a war of liberation, expelling the Hyksos and ushering in the New Kingdom. This historical memory of foreign domination profoundly influenced subsequent Egyptian attitudes, fostering a strong anti-foreigner sentiment, especially towards Semitic peoples, even as Egypt itself became an imperial power that brought many foreigners into its sphere. This Hyksos era, despite its eventual end, provides a critical piece of historical context. It demonstrates unequivocally that large communities of Semitic people could indeed reside in Egypt, even rising to positions of significant power and exerting influence. It shows that the idea of a distinct, large foreign group living in Egypt, as the biblical narrative describes the Israelites in Goshen, is not historically improbable. Their eventual expulsion, however, also reveals a periodic Egyptian policy of forcibly removing or subjugating foreign groups, perceived as a threat or simply as a resource to be exploited. This deep historical precedent helps us to understand the complex social dynamics surrounding foreigners in Egypt during the New Kingdom. It offers a crucial lens through which to examine the biblical account of the Israelites' long sojourn, initially welcomed, then enslaved, and ultimately expelled. The ancient history of foreign populations in Egypt is not merely a matter of scholarly speculation. It is a well-documented aspect of Egyptian society, evidenced through archaeological discoveries and textual records, clearly illustrating a continuous influx and efflux of people for various reasons, profoundly shaping the diverse cultural landscape. Moving into the New Kingdom, the presence of diverse populations in ancient Egypt, particularly Semitic peoples, continued to be a significant feature of Egyptian society, albeit now under Egyptian rather than foreign rule. These groups entered Egypt through various channels, driven by different circumstances. Many were war captives, brought back from successful military campaigns in Canaan and Syria by pharaohs like Thutmose III, Seti I, and Ramesses II, as captured individuals were considered assets of the state. These captives were often assigned to state projects, monumental temple complexes, or private agricultural estates as forced laborers or servants, contributing directly to the Egyptian economy. Other foreigners came as voluntary immigrants, drawn by the perceived prosperity and opportunities in the rich Nile Delta region, especially during times of famine or political instability in their homelands in the Levant. Merchants, skilled artisans, and even diplomatic envoys from various Near Eastern regions also found their way into Egyptian society, creating cosmopolitan hubs within major cities. Archaeological evidence from sites in the Delta, most notably at Tel el-Dabah, strongly supports the widespread presence of these non-Egyptian communities. Excavations have unearthed distinct types of pottery, architectural styles, such as the widespread use of four-room houses, and courtyard structures more typical of the Levant, and even burial practices that are clearly non-Egyptian, existing alongside native Egyptian remains. These findings indicate the presence of significant Canaanite and broader Semitic communities living and working alongside native Egyptians in the Delta. Their social status within Egypt varied considerably, ranging from relatively integrated free laborers or even minor administrative officials to indentured servants bound by contract, and even chattel slaves who were personal property. Papyri from the period often list individuals with recognizably Semitic names working in various capacities, from agricultural field laborers to domestic servants in noble households, even military personnel. This widespread presence of known Egyptians, including those from the Levant, means that the idea of a distinct Israelite group living in Egypt is not inherently improbable from a historical standpoint, as this demonstrates the reality of diverse populations in ancient Egypt during this powerful imperial era. A particularly intriguing and much debated term found in ancient Egyptian records, one that has captivated biblical scholars for decades, is Apiru or Habiru. This term appears in a variety of texts from the New Kingdom, as well as in other ancient Near Eastern documents, like the Amarna letters. Egyptian texts mention Apiru being engaged in quarrying, building, and agricultural work for the state. For instance, a stele from Beit Shean records Apiru of the mountain being transported to Egypt. The papyrus Leidni 348, dating to the reign of Ramesses II, specifically refers to Apiru bringing stones for the construction projects of the pharaoh. Another text, Papyrus Anastasi 2, lists Apiru as being supplied with rations while working for the pharaoh. These references confirm the presence of groups identifiable as Apiru engaged in state labor within Egypt, suggesting a system where displaced or indentured foreigners were utilized in large-scale projects. However, these documents never describe a vast, unified ethnic group like the biblical Israelites, numbering in the millions. They are always smaller, diverse groups, integrated into the larger existing labor force, managed by Egyptian administrators. This makes the Egyptian records of foreign workers an interesting, but ultimately inconclusive piece of the puzzle. They provide a historical context for the presence of foreign laborers in Egypt, but not definitive proof of the biblical exodus as described. Crucially, Apiru is understood by scholars to be a socioeconomic term, not a distinct ethnic label. Reticellus, marginalized individuals or groups who operated outside the established societal norms. They could be rootless mercenaries, bandits, agricultural laborers who had fled their lands, or indentured servants bound by debt. They are depicted in contexts both within Egypt and in Egyptian-controlled Qanon, highlighting their nomadic or transient nature. For historians and biblical scholars, the immediate question arises: is there a direct connection between Apiru and the biblical Hebrews? While the phonetic similarity is striking and has led to much speculation, it's not a one-to-one correlation. Not all Apru were necessarily Hebrews, and conversely, not all Hebrews would have been classified as Apru. Nevertheless, the Aparu references provide valuable context regarding the presence of certain types of foreign laborers in Egypt. Understanding the actual nature of forced labor in ancient Egypt is fundamental to grasping the reality behind the biblical narrative of Israelite bondage. The widespread popular image, often perpetuated by Hollywood, of millions of shackled slaves building the pyramids or cities like Pyramidus is, in large part, a misconception. While chattel slavery certainly existed in ancient Egypt, particularly involving foreign war captives or individuals sold into servitude due to debt or crime, it was not the primary labor force for monumental state projects. The backbone of Egyptian monumental construction, irrigation projects, and agricultural work was instead labor. This was a mandatory civic duty, a form of taxation paid in labor, required of all able-bodied Egyptian men for a certain period each year. These individuals were not slaves in the traditional sense. They were citizens fulfilling their obligations to the state, often working in rotating shifts, particularly during the annual Nile inundation, when agricultural work was impossible. This system was incredibly efficient for mobilizing vast numbers of people for a finite period, ensuring grand projects could be completed. Foreign captives were also incorporated into this state-controlled labor system, often resettled in specifically built labor camps. Archaeological evidence from workers' villages, such as the one excavated at Giza near the pyramids, shows that these laborers, whether native, Egyptian, or foreign, received regular rations, had access to housing, and even received basic medical care, suggesting a managed and relatively sustained workforce rather than a neglected one. While the work itself was undoubtedly arduous and often brutal, enforced by strict overseers and accompanied by harsh punishments for shirking duties, it operated within a structured system of state-controlled conscription rather than perpetual merciless chattel slavery as we often conceive it. Papyri, like Papyrus Anastasi Vi, a New Kingdom text, vividly illustrate the constant demands placed on various groups, including Apiru and other laborers, detailing strict quotas, and the constant pressure to complete tasks under the watchful eye of state officials. So, while the biblical narrative of the Israelites experiencing forced labor is consistent with what we know of Egyptian state labor, it would have been within this established, highly organized system that relied heavily on state conscription and management, rather than solely on an independent, ethnically distinct, enslaved group, which is a key distinction for understanding the forced labor in ancient Egypt. The daily life and working conditions for these foreign workers in ancient Egypt, particularly in the bustling eastern Nile Delta during the reign of Ramesses II, would have been a complex mix of hardship, structured provision, and a degree of cultural integration. The biblical Ramses is almost universally identified with Pyramidus, the grand new capital city established by Ramesses II. Archaeological excavations at Tel el-Daba have confirmed its immense scale and its significant non-Egyptian population. Evidence points to distinct Semitic quarters within the city, with houses and religious structures reflecting Canaanite architectural styles and deities, indicating a vibrant presence of foreign communities living and working alongside native Egyptians. These foreign laborers, many of them Canaanites or other Semitic peoples, would have been directly involved in the pharaoh's monumental construction projects. Their lives were undoubtedly physically demanding, characterized by arduous labor, strict supervision from Egyptian overseers, and limited personal freedom. However, the archaeological and textual evidence also suggests a degree of systematized management for these workers. Papyri described the rations they received, typically grain, beer, and vegetables, which imply a regular, basic provision system, consistent with a managed workforce, rather than one left to starve. These documents also provide glimpses into the challenges faced by overseers, such as complaints of workers shirking their duties, being sick, or attempting to run away, reflecting the inherent difficulties of managing large, often unwilling, labor pools. Skeletal remains from workers' cemeteries often show signs of arduous physical labor, such as joint degeneration, arthritis, and healed fractures, indicating a life of hard toil. Yet, the presence of healed fractures also suggests that some form of basic medical care or rehabilitation was provided, likely to maintain the workforce's productivity. Therefore, while the biblical narrative emphasizes unrelenting oppression, the historical and archaeological reality points to a sophisticated, albeit strict, and often brutal, system of state-controlled labor where foreign populations were integrated into the vast machinery of the Egyptian state, essential for building its monumental symbols of power. This understanding provides a more grounded perspective on life for foreign workers in ancient Egypt. The very scale of Ramesses II's building projects, and indeed the remarkable longevity and resilience of the ancient Egyptian state itself, speaks volumes about the extraordinary sophistication of the ancient Egyptian government's efficiency and its unparalleled administrative capacity. This was not a chaotic, disorganized empire. It was a highly centralized bureaucracy, meticulously designed to control and manage virtually every aspect of national life, from agricultural output and taxation to monumental construction projects and vast military campaigns. At the very heart of this intricate system were the scribes, the literate elite who served as the indispensable administrative backbone of Egypt. These highly trained professionals maintained incredibly detailed records on papyrus and astraca, comprehensive censuses of people and livestock, precise land surveys for agricultural planning, meticulous labor rosters for every state project, detailed inventory lists for food supplies and building materials, and daily reports on work progress and worker attendance. Every individual, every resource, every transaction was meticulously tracked and recorded, leaving behind a wealth of administrative documents that modern scholars continue to unearth and analyze. The efficiency of this system extended to vast logistical operations. A highly developed network of granaries was responsible for collecting, storing, and distributing the immense agricultural output needed to feed the populace and sustain massive workforces, ensuring consistent provision even for large-scale projects like temple construction or military expeditions. The country was geographically divided into administrative districts called nomes, each with its own governor or official responsible for implementing royal decrees, collecting taxes, and mobilizing conscripts for state service. The military, beyond its role in conquest and defense, also played a crucial role in internal security, enforcing labor decrees, and managing foreign populations. Such a highly organized and interconnected administrative system would have made any large-scale, unauthorized movement of people particularly a group numbering in the millions, as described in the Bible. Incredibly difficult to conceal or achieve without leaving a massive, undeniable administrative and logistical footprint. The very precision and comprehensive nature of Egyptian record-keeping for even seemingly minor details make the absolute silence on an event as catastrophic as the biblical Exodus all the more striking and historically challenging. This complex administrative system highlights the organizational power of ancient Egypt. Indeed, during the Late Bronze Age, which is the period when the Exodus is traditionally placed by scholars favoring a 13th century BCE date, Egypt's influence over QAnon was not merely significant, it was absolute. For centuries, QAnon was effectively an Egyptian province, tightly controlled through a sophisticated network of vassal city-states, imposing Egyptian fortresses and permanent administrative centers. These letters are desperate pleas from Canaanite vassal rulers to the Egyptian pharaoh, begging for military aid against various internal threats, including the very Apiru we discussed earlier, and vehemently reaffirming their loyalty to Egypt. These letters vividly depict a QAnon deeply entangled in Egyptian politics and directly dependent on Egyptian military protection and oversight. This omnipresent Egyptian control in Canaan presents a profound historical challenge to the biblical narrative of a large Israelite force entering and conquering the land immediately after exiting Egypt. If millions of Israelites, having just dramatically escaped Egyptian bondage, were to enter Canaan, they would not be encountering a political vacuum or a collection of isolated, weak city-states. They would be walking directly into heavily garrisoned Egyptian-controlled territory, likely facing immediate and direct confrontation with formidable Egyptian garrisons and their loyal Canaanite vassal armies. The biblical narrative of total conquest and immediate settlement clashes sharply with this historical reality of overwhelming Egyptian imperial presence, making the Egyptian control over QAnon a critical historical fact. Archaeological excavations across dozens of sites in QAnon have unearthed abundant and irrefutable evidence of this pervasive Egyptian dominance. Countless Egyptian scarabs, distinctive pottery, monumental inscriptions detailing Egyptian presence, and even actual Egyptian garrisons and administrative buildings, such as those unearthed at strategic sites like Beth Shean, Gaza, and Lachish. These sites served as crucial strongholds, ensuring Egyptian authority and facilitating the flow of tribute and resources back to the Nile Valley. The presence of Egyptian officials, soldiers, and tax collectors was a daily reality for the inhabitants of Canaan. One of the most valuable sources of information about this period is the cache of Amarna letters, a collection of 14th century BCE diplomatic correspondence discovered in Egypt. This brings us to one of the most significant and compelling points of historical contention: the profound absence of direct Egyptian evidence for the Exodus. Despite the meticulously organized record-keeping system we've just explored, the vast administrative apparatus, and the extensive monumental inscriptions that detail even minor victories, rebellions, and foreign interactions, there is absolutely no mention in any surviving Egyptian text or archaeological record of the events described in the biblical Exodus. There is no account of the 10 devastating plagues that supposedly crippled the nation, no record of a mass migration of millions of Israelite slaves, no military defeat of a pharaoh and his entire army drowned in the Red Sea, and crucially, no hint of a national catastrophe of such unprecedented scale. This is not simply a matter of inconvenient silence. It is a profound and overwhelming absence where, by all historical expectations and the sheer scale of the biblical account, there should be overwhelming, undeniable evidence. To put this into perspective, ancient Egyptian records meticulously documented foreign relations, tribute from conquered lands, the numbers of prisoners of war, and even the logistics of supplying various construction projects and military campaigns. They recorded droughts, famines, and internal unrest. Yet, for an event of such unprecedented scale and devastating impact, the loss of the firstborn in every Egyptian home, the destruction of their vital Nile River, the decimation of their livestock, the utter humiliation and drowning of the entire royal army. In synthesizing what we've explored in this segment, a clearer, if less dramatic, picture of ancient Egypt emerges, challenging many popular assumptions about the Exodus. We have seen that Egypt was indeed a powerful, highly centralized, and meticulously organized empire, fully capable of managing vast resources and controlling its large population. We have also established that there is ample archaeological and textual evidence for the presence of diverse foreign populations within Egypt, including Semitic peoples, many of whom were incorporated into its extensive state. Labor systems consistent with the biblical idea of Israelites living and working in Egypt. The existence of cities like pyramids built by massive labor forces perfectly fits the type of royal projects that would have required such immense human effort. However, the fundamental and overwhelming challenge to the biblical narrative remains the complete and utter absence of direct evidence for the biblical scale Exodus. There is no archaeological trace, no Egyptian record, and no historical echo of plagues, a mass migration of millions, or the total annihilation of Pharaoh's army. This means that while the biblical story might contain kernels of historical memory, perhaps of smaller-scale movements of Semitic groups, or a memory of servitude under Egyptian rule, the grand, miraculous narrative of millions being liberated in a single cataclysmic event is not supported by the Egyptian historical record. The gap between the biblical account of millions departing civilizations of the ancient world is too vast for historians to ignore. This analysis compels us to consider that the true story of Israel's origins, while perhaps still rooted in a memory of foreign oppression and eventual emergence, might be far less dramatic, less supernatural, and ultimately more unromantic than the epic tale we've inherited. This thorough historical context, detailing the ancient context of the Exodus story, is not just an academic exercise. It is the very foundation upon which we must now build our understanding of the challenging truths that emerge when sacred narrative meets hard historical inquiry. It forces us to confront uncomfortable questions, but ultimately promises a more accurate understanding of the past. Now, as we move forward in our journey to shatter the myth, we must transition from examining the powerful empire from which the Israelites supposedly departed, to the vast, unforgiving landscapes through which they are said to have traveled. If the biblical exodus of millions truly occurred, and if the subsequent conquest of Canaan was as swift and total as described, then the physical evidence of the Sinai desert and the ancient cities of Canaan should provide unmistakable, tangible evidence of such momentous events. Vast numbers of people moving through a desert for decades, engaging in major battles, and settling new lands should leave an undeniable archaeological footprint: pottery, campsites, destruction layers, burial sites, and more. However, as we will discover in our next crucial segment, The physical evidence of the Sinai and QAnon tells a very different story, leading to a profound archaeological silence that further challenges the traditional narrative. Prepare to delve directly into the ground itself as we sift through the dust of millennia and examine what the digs reveal and what they pointedly do not about the legendary journey of the Israelites. Join us next time on History for the Tired as we continue our quest for the unromantic truth, digging deep into the historical reality of the Exodus. In our previous deep dive, we meticulously unpacked the biblical narrative of the Exodus, understanding its theological power and literary complexities. We then ventured into the heart of ancient Egypt, examining the vast capabilities of the New Kingdom Empire, its sophisticated administration, and its long history of managing diverse foreign populations, including Semitic peoples. Our conclusion from that exploration was startling. Despite Egypt's meticulous record-keeping and immense historical footprint, there is a profound and unsettling silence regarding any event resembling the biblical Exodus. No mention of devastating plagues, no loss of an entire army, no mass exodus of millions of slaves. This historical vacuum within Egyptian records immediately raises a critical question for any truth seeker. If the narrative is uncorroborated by the very empire it describes, what then does the physical land itself, the archaeological record, reveal? This brings us to the core of our current investigation, a startling discovery known as the archaeological silence. The biblical narrative paints a vivid picture of a miraculous journey, millions of Israelites, along with their livestock, traversing the vast arid expanse of the Sinai wilderness for a staggering 40 years. This wasn't a quick sprint. It was a decades-long sojourn involving an entire generation living, dying, and constantly moving through one of the most inhospitable deserts on Earth. The sheer scale of this journey demands contemplation. We are talking about perhaps 2 to 3 million people, a population larger than many modern cities, moving as a single, cohesive unit. The logistical challenge alone providing food, water, and sanitation for such an immense multitude for 40 years in a barren desert is staggering to imagine. From a purely archaeological perspective, such a movement should leave behind an undeniable, indeed colossal, physical footprint. Millions of people, their animals, their daily activities of camping, cooking, burying their dead, and leaving behind discarded tools and pottery shards should create a continuous trail of archaeological evidence across the desert floor. This is a fundamental expectation for any group, let alone one of such unparalleled size, moving through a specific geographical region for such a prolonged period. For decades, dedicated archaeologists, often driven by a desire to either confirm or challenge the biblical narrative, have embarked on extensive archaeological surveys of the Sinai wilderness. These expeditions have employed cutting-edge techniques, from aerial reconnaissance to meticulous ground-penetrating radar, systematically searching for any trace of the vast encampments and continuous movement described in the Bible. It encompasses a near-total void of the very types of material culture that any human group, no matter how transient, would inevitably leave behind. For a population of 2 to 3 million, living and dying in the desert for 40 years, archaeologists would expect to find countless pottery shards, fragments of daily cooking pots, storage jars, and serving vessels, which are incredibly durable and survive for millennia. They would anticipate discovering thousands of campsites, marked by the remains of hearths, fire pits, temporary shelters, and discarded tools. Moreover, A generation dying in the wilderness would necessitate tens of thousands of burial sites, which should be archaeologically detectable. Even transient groups of hundreds, like ancient nomadic Bedouin tribes, leave behind clear, albeit dispersed, archaeological traces. Millions for decades would leave massive, undeniable evidence visible for millennia. The areas surveyed include not only the traditional routes of the Exodus, but also alternative paths that might have been feasible. Researchers have scoured potential campsites, watering holes, and ancient pathways for any sign of a prolonged presence of a large population during the Late Bronze Age, the period during which the Exodus is generally believed to have occurred. What these comprehensive surveys have consistently revealed, however, is a remarkable and utterly consistent finding. There is no evidence whatsoever of large, long-term settlements or even widespread temporary camps that can be attributed to millions of people from the Late Bronze Age. This profound absence stands in stark contrast to what would be expected from a migrating population of this magnitude, presenting a significant hurdle for those seeking historical confirmation of the biblical account. This absence of evidence is not merely a lack of definitive smoking gun artifacts. Furthermore, archaeologists would anticipate finding a wealth of discarded tools, simple objects of daily life, and even inscriptions or graffiti left by a literate population. Given the biblical depiction of Moses and the giving of the law, and Rephidim, and especially Mount Sinai itself, have proven incredibly difficult to identify definitively. The Bible provides geographical descriptions, but these are often vague or have changed over millennia. While various locations have been proposed for Mount Sinai, the most famous being Jabal Musa in the southern Sinai Peninsula, a site chosen by early Christian hermits. Archaeological excavations conducted near these traditional or proposed locations have consistently yielded a disheartening result. No significant Late Bronze Age evidence of a massive Israelite encampment or any other activity that could be attributed to the biblical journey. For example, extensive surveys and excavations around Jabal Musa have primarily revealed Byzantine-era monastic settlements, not evidence of a large Bronze Age population. Yet, despite extensive and systematic searches, the vast Sinai Desert, which has preserved evidence of much smaller and far older nomadic groups, remains virtually silent on the passage of millions of Israelites during the Late Bronze Age. The material culture that is found in the Sinai from this period consists almost entirely of isolated Egyptian mining camps or small scattered Bedouin encampments, nothing that remotely suggests a population of biblical proportions. This striking and near total absence of Late Bronze Age material culture that can be attributed to millions of people is not merely surprising. It represents a fundamental challenge to the literal historicity of the Exodus narrative. It's not just that the archaeologists haven't found the specific evidence for the Exodus. It's that they have unfound any evidence for any large population movement of that period and scale, making it a critical aspect of Exodus archaeology investigations. Beyond the general archaeological silence, the traditional biblical sites mentioned in the Exodus narrative, such as Merah, Elah, the absence of archaeological support for the traditional journey route, and the specific stopping points mentioned in the Bible is a critical piece of the puzzle. If Mount Sinai were truly the site of such a profound divine revelation to millions, one would expect to find monumental evidence of cultic activity, large-scale camps, or even inscriptions from the time. The biblical narrative, particularly in the book of Joshua, describes a dramatic and decisive conquest of Canaan by a unified Israelite army led by Joshua. This account details a series of swift and brutal military campaigns, culminating in the complete destruction of fortified Canaanite cities and the extermination of their inhabitants, often under divine command. Cities like Jericho, Ai, and Hazor are explicitly mentioned as falling to the Israelite invaders, with vivid descriptions of collapsing walls and widespread devastation. From an archaeological perspective, such a narrative would lead to clear expectations. We should find distinct destruction layers at these specific Canaanite cities dating to the late Bronze Age. Furthermore, following these destruction layers, we would anticipate finding evidence of new population groups, marked by a sudden and dramatic shift in material culture, pottery types, architectural styles, and burial practices, indicating a new ethnic group taking over. Instead, the area, like much of the Sinai, is archaeologically barren for the late Bronze Age in terms of human habitation on a large scale. This consistent lack of evidence at potential biblical sites, coupled with the overall silence across the vast desert, further compounds the challenges to the literal interpretation of the Exodus as a mass migration. It forces us to ask not just where is the evidence, but why is there no evidence, suggesting that the traditional route and scale of the journey might not align with historical reality, leading to ongoing debates in biblical archaeology. Our investigation now shifts from the desolate plains of the Sinai to the land flowing with milk and honey, Canaan itself. Therefore, the archaeological investigation of Canaanite cities, particularly those explicitly named in the conquest narrative, becomes a crucial test case for the historicity of the biblical account. The sites of Jericho and Ai are arguably the most important of these, given their prominent and dramatic roles in the book of Joshua. Early excavators, like John Garstang in the 1930s, initially believed they had found evidence of walls collapsing around the time of Joshua. However, later, more rigorous excavations conducted by British archaeologist Kathleen Kenyon in the 1950s revolutionized our understanding of Jericho. Her precise stratigraphical work demonstrated that, while there were indeed massive city walls that collapsed and signs of destruction by fire, these events occurred centuries earlier, primarily in the early Bronze Age and again in the Middle Bronze Age. Crucially, Kenyon's findings revealed that during the late Bronze Age, the proposed period of Joshua's conquest, Jericho was not a large fortified city with massive walls. In fact, it appears to have been either sparsely inhabited or not inhabited at all, as a significant urban center, lacking the substantial defenses described in the biblical account. Jericho, with its famously collapsing walls, represents the initial miraculous victory, while Ai's conquest symbolizes a subsequent strategic triumph. Archaeologists have, for over a century, meticulously excavated these sites, carefully sifting through layers of ancient ruins, precisely dating their findings. The results from these key sites provide some of the most compelling challenges to a literal reading of the conquest narrative, revealing a reality that starkly contrasts with the biblical depiction. These sites are not merely ruins. They are windows into a past that often tells a different story from the one many Americans grew up learning in Sunday school, directly engaging with ancient Israel archaeology and the narrative of conquest. The archaeological findings at Tel Eselton, the site of ancient Jericho, provide one of the most prominent contradictions to the biblical conquest narrative. This finding creates a profound Jericho problem for those who interpret the biblical account literally. The biblical narrative describes a major, strongly fortified city whose walls miraculously fall, leading to its conquest. The book of Joshua vividly describes Ai as a fortified Canaanite city whose capture involved military strategy, a temporary defeat for Israel, and ultimately a complete destruction by fire, with Joshua himself setting the city ablaze. Given its detailed portrayal as a major conquest target, archaeologists have extensively excavated it, the most commonly identified site for ancient Ai. The findings here present an even more definitive challenge to the biblical narrative than Jericho. Excavations revealed that Etel was indeed a large and significant fortified city, but only during the early Bronze Age, thousands of years before the proposed time of Joshua. This early Bronze Age city was utterly destroyed around 2400 BCE and, crucially, remained abandoned for a millennium before the late Bronze Age. However, archaeology indicates that no such city, with walls capable of falling, existed at Jericho during the late Bronze Age, while some later scholars have attempted to redate or reinterpret Kenyon's findings or suggested alternative locations for Jericho. The overwhelming consensus among mainstream archaeologists is that there is no archaeological evidence for a late Bronze Age city at Jericho for Joshua to conquer. This is not a subtle discrepancy. It is a fundamental contradiction between the detailed biblical account and the physical evidence from the ground. The site that should bear the most dramatic testimony to the conquest is remarkably silent about it, challenging the very notion of a literal, large-scale Israelite invasion and forcing historians to critically reevaluate archaeological discoveries in the Holy Land. Another site, equally pivotal in the biblical conquest narrative, is Ai, meaning ruin in Hebrew. This means that during the period when the biblical Joshua was supposedly leading the Israelites, there was no city of Ai at Etel Forum to conquer or destroy. The site was an uninhabited ruin, a desolate mound. Hazor, located in northern Israel, was indeed one of the largest and most powerful Canaanite city-states during the late Bronze Age. The book of Joshua describes Hazor as the head of all those kingdoms, and recounts its conquest by Joshua, who burned it completely, stating, "Hazor formerly was the head of all these kingdoms." Archaeological excavations at Tel Hazor, particularly by Professor Amnon Bentor, have revealed extensive and dramatic destruction layers dating to the late 13th century BCE, consistent with a violent conflagration. This indeed matches a powerful city being utterly destroyed by fire around the proposed time of the conquest. On the surface, this might seem to corroborate the biblical account, making Hazor a crucial point for those who support biblical archaeology facts. This creates an insurmountable AI problem for those seeking literal historical confirmation of the biblical conquest. While some minimalist scholars argue that the story of Ai might be an etiological myth, story created to explain why a particular place was in ruins, perhaps incorporating ancient memories of an earlier destruction. The archaeological record unequivocally demonstrates that the detailed military conquest described in Joshua simply could not have occurred at this site during the late Bronze Age. The lack of any substantial late Bronze Age occupation makes it impossible to reconcile the archaeological evidence with the biblical account of Ai's destruction by Joshua, cementing the profound archaeological conflict with the biblical narrative. While Jericho and Ai present clear contradictions, the site of Hazor offers a more complex, though still nuanced, picture. However, the complexities arise when attempting to definitively attribute this destruction specifically to the Israelites under Joshua. While Hazor's destruction aligns chronologically with the conquest period, attributing it unequivocally to the Israelites is challenging because there were many potential agents of destruction during this tumultuous period, provides a crucial context for understanding Israel's emergence. The biblical conquest narrative suggests a swift, unified military invasion, resulting in the widespread destruction of Canaanite cities and a sudden, large-scale replacement of Canaanite culture by a new Israelite one. However, the archaeological record consistently tells a different story. Instead of widespread destruction of major Canaanite centers, followed by immediate Israelite takeover, archaeology reveals a more gradual emergence of new settlements, primarily in the central highlands of Canaan. These new settlements, often identified as the earliest Israelite villages, are largely unfortified villages, not conquered cities. They typically consist of simple agrarian homesteads, characterized by distinctive four-room houses and kalarim storage jars, which become hallmarks of early Israelite material culture. The Late Bronze Age was a time of widespread upheaval across the entire eastern Mediterranean, marked by the collapse of empires, internal revolts, and the mysterious movements of the Sea Peoples. Egyptian pharaohs, like Seti I and Ramesses II, also conducted campaigns in Canaan during this era, and they too could have been responsible for such destruction. Furthermore, while Hazor was indeed destroyed, the subsequent Iron Age I settlement at Hazor is much smaller and simpler, showing a significant cultural discontinuity rather than a direct takeover. There is no definitive archaeological evidence within the destruction layer itself, such as distinct Israelite pottery or specific weaponry, that uniquely links the devastation of Hazor to Joshua's army. Therefore, while Hazor's destruction is consistent with the possibility of a conquest, it cannot be definitively attributed to the Israelites, leaving it as a partial correspondence rather than conclusive proof. Beyond these specific test cases, a broader analysis of the general patterns of settlement in QAnon during the transition from the Late Bronze Age to the Early Iron Age. Crucially, these new highland settlements often show a remarkable continuity with Canaanite material culture rather than a sudden, dramatic break. Their pottery, agricultural practices, and even some religious artifacts suggest an indigenous development or a slow assimilation, rather than a total cultural replacement by an invading foreign force. Furthermore, there is no archaeological evidence of a unified, invading army, no distinctive Israelite weaponry, no widespread destruction layers that can be definitively linked to a single, coordinated military campaign across the region, and no distinct cultural markers indicating millions of people suddenly arriving from outside. Instead, the evidence points to a process of internal societal changes, perhaps involving former Canaanite peasants, Apiru, or small nomadic groups who settled in the highlands rather than a massive external invasion. This widespread archaeological pattern across Canaan strongly supports the notion of an archaeological silence concerning a unified conquest, prompting scholars to consider alternative models for the origins of early Israel, directly challenging the biblical account of conquest. In this light, one of the most important extra-biblical pieces of evidence concerning early Israel is the Merneptah stele. This monumental stone slab, discovered in 1896 in Egypt, dates to approximately 1208 BCE during the reign of Pharaoh Merneptah. The stele records Merneptah's military campaigns in Canaan, listing various defeated peoples and city-states, including Ashkelon, Gezer, and Yanum. The crucial line for our discussion reads, "Israel is laid waste, its seed is not." This represents the first undisputed extra-biblical mention of Israel in any ancient text. Its significance cannot be overstated, as it confirms that a distinct entity identified as Israel existed in Qanon by the late 13th century BCE. However, the context of the mention is equally critical. The phrase, "its seed is not," indicates that Israel is referred to not as a city-state, but as a stateless, nomadic, or semi-nomadic group without permanent urban centers. This suggests that Israel at this time was a rural, tribal entity living in the Canaanite highlands, consistent with the archaeological findings of early Israelite settlements. The Merneptah stele presents a complex challenge to the traditional Exodus narrative, particularly regarding its timing. If the Exodus occurred in the mid-15th century BCE, or even the early 13th century BCE, the late date, the profound silence in the Sinai, where millions of people would have left an undeniable archaeological footprint for 40 years, is incredibly striking. The findings at key Canaanite sites like Jericho and Ai directly contradict the biblical accounts of their destruction, indicating they were not inhabited as major cities at the time of the supposed conquest. Even at Hazor, where destruction did occur, it cannot be definitively linked to a unified Israelite invasion. Instead, the broader archaeological pattern in Qanon points to a gradual emergence of early Israelite settlements from within the indigenous population, marked by cultural continuity rather than a sudden, violent replacement. This lack of supporting evidence is not a dismissal of the profound and enduring memory of a foundational story, but rather a direct challenge to its literal historical interpretation as a massive, unified event, generally favored by those who try to connect it to Ramesses II, and a 40-year wilderness wandering followed. Then a massive invasion of Qanon would logically occur after 1208 BCE, yet the Merneptah stele unequivocally states that Israel was already in Qanon by 1208 BCE. This means that if the Exodus and conquest happened as described, then Israel had to have been in Canaan before Merneptah's campaign, which would push the Exodus date even earlier, creating more archaeological problems. Or it suggests that the Israel mentioned by Merneptah represents a group distinct from the one that supposedly left Egypt later. More likely, it implies that the emergence of Israel was not through a grand, unified invasion from Egypt, but through a more gradual, indigenous process within Canaan itself. This inscription, a genuine ancient Egypt record of Israel, provides vital evidence that fundamentally reshapes our understanding of early Israel's origins, complicating the traditional biblical timeline and narrative of events, directly challenging the notion of a massive invasion. In synthesizing the overwhelming evidence from the ground, the conclusion is clear and consistent. The archaeological record of the Sinai, Speckler, Wilderness, and Canaan simply does not support the literal, large-scale biblical exodus and conquest narratives. This archaeological silence, coupled with the absence of evidence from Egyptian records, compels us to reevaluate our understanding of the Exodus. If the conventional narrative, as a mass exodus and unified conquest, does not fit the historical and archaeological facts, then what are the alternative explanations for Israel's origins? What could have happened that provided the historical kernel for such a powerful and enduring story? And how might we understand the miraculous elements, like the plagues, if not as literal supernatural events? These questions lead us to fascinating academic theories that propose alternative scenarios for the emergence of Israel, blending historical possibilities with the recognition of the biblical text's profound theological purpose. We must now move beyond simply disproving the literal account and begin to construct plausible alternatives that respect both the archaeological evidence and the enduring power of the biblical narrative. This shifts our focus from what didn't happen to what could have happened, pushing the boundaries of biblical history research. In our next segment, we will delve into these fascinating alternative theories. We will explore how modern scholarship attempts to explain the phenomenon of Israel's emergence in Canaan, considering various models that integrate archaeological findings with textual analysis. We will also examine naturalistic and scientific explanations for the phenomena described as the 10 plagues, seeking to understand if these miracles might have been spectacular natural events amplified through theological lenses. This journey promises to be as intriguing as it is enlightening, offering new perspectives on a story that has shaped Western civilization for millennia. Join us next time on History for the Tired, as we continue to shatter the myths and uncover the unromantic truths of the biblical Exodus, always seeking to illuminate the past with the light of evidence and critical inquiry. In our preceding 2 segments, we meticulously navigated the biblical narrative of the Exodus, understanding its profound theological resonance, and then ventured into the historical realities of ancient Egypt and the vast archaeological landscape of the Sinai and Canaan. First, we will examine compelling naturalistic explanations for the 10 plagues. For centuries, these divine judgments have been seen as quintessential miracles, supernatural interventions, defying the laws of nature. However, modern scientific understanding and a deep knowledge of ancient Egyptian ecology and climate offer intriguing hypotheses that suggest these events, while perhaps spectacular and devastating, could have been rooted in a series of interconnected natural phenomena, dramatically amplified and reinterpreted through a theological lens by a people seeking to understand God's hand in their liberation. Secondly, and perhaps even more profoundly, we will delve into the leading alternative theories for Israel's emergence in Canaan. These scholarly models challenge the traditional conquest narrative, proposing instead more gradual internal processes of social transformation that better align with the archaeological evidence discussed in Part 3. This exploration is intent to diminish the spiritual power of the biblical narrative for believers, but rather an endeavor to unearth a more historically grounded understanding of Israel's earliest beginnings, providing a nuanced perspective for our American audience interested in the biblical origins of Israel. Our journey led us to a consistent and challenging conclusion. The grand literal account of a mass exodus of millions of people from Egypt, followed by a unified, sweeping conquest of Canaan, finds virtually no corroboration in the historical or archaeological record. The silence from Egypt, coupled with the contradictory evidence from the ground in the Sinai and Canaan, compels us to move beyond simply highlighting what didn't happen. Instead, it pushes us towards a deeper, more intellectually satisfying quest to explore what could have happened. This pivotal segment marks a shift from deconstruction to reconstruction as we turn our gaze towards more plausible, evidence-based explanations for both the dramatic events described in the plagues and, even more fundamentally, for the very origins of Israel itself, seeking to understand the historical plausibility of the Exodus. Our exploration in this segment will branch into two primary avenues of inquiry. Let us begin by re-examining the first and most iconic of the biblical plagues, the Nile turning to blood. The narrative describes the river transforming into a putrid, undrinkable substance, killing all the fish and causing immense suffering. As the algae die and decompose, they consume vast amounts of oxygen in the water, leading to the rapid and widespread death of fish. Precisely as the Bible states, the fish in the Nile died, and the Nile stank, so that the Egyptians could not drink water from the Nile. Furthermore, some species of algae produce potent toxins that are harmful or lethal to aquatic life, animals and humans upon ingestion. While the Nile's vastness might make a total transformation difficult, localized, severe blooms in accessible areas or tributaries could have created the impression of the entire river being affected, especially from the perspective of those living in the delta. This initial event would not only trigger an ecological catastrophe, but also set in motion a chain reaction, directly impacting the subsequent plagues, illustrating the scientific analysis of the plagues. From a naturalistic perspective, the most compelling scientific explanation for this phenomenon is a severe red algae bloom, often referred to as a red tide, when it occurs in marine environments. Certain species of freshwater algae, such as Oscillatoria rubescens or Pfiesteria piscicida, can, under specific environmental conditions, multiply explosively. These conditions are typically found in a river system like the Nile. Unusually low water levels, coupled with high temperatures and stagnation, particularly in the sluggish northern reaches of the delta, where the Israelites are traditionally located. When these conditions align, a vast proliferation of algae can occur, turning the water a reddish-brown hue due to the pigments within the algal cells. The consequences of such a massive algal bloom would be devastating, precisely mirroring the biblical description. Building on the ecological ripple effect, the subsequent plagues, livestock, disease, and boils, can also be understood as direct consequences of the preceding insect infestations and the overall deterioration of environmental health. The constant irritation from biting insects, particularly if the affected individuals had compromised immune systems due to stress or poor nutrition, could lead to severe skin infections. These could range from widespread allergic reactions to insect bites to secondary bacterial infections from scratching or from direct transmission of pathogens carried by the insects. Alternatively, some scholars suggest the boils could be a symptom of a more systemic illness, such as glanders, a bacterial disease that affects horses and can be transmitted to humans, causing skin lesions, or a severe form of smallpox-like disease whose spread would be greatly facilitated by poor hygiene and the proliferation of disease vectors in the aftermath of the previous plagues. Thus, these two plagues are not isolated incidents, but rather logical developments within an escalating pattern of ecological and biological disaster. A very real scientific explanation for biblical events. The swarms of biting insects from plagues 3 and 4 are well-known vectors for transmitting a wide range of diseases among animal populations. For example, certain biting flies can transmit highly contagious and often fatal diseases to livestock, such as anthrax or blue-tongue virus, which causes severe illness in ruminants. The sheer numbers of insects, coupled with the stress on animals from contaminated water and the initial environmental chaos, would have created conditions ripe for rapid disease transmission among the vulnerable livestock populations, leading to widespread mortality, as described in the Bible. Similarly, the boils and festering sores that erupted on both humans and animals can be plausibly linked to the preceding plagues. The next 3 plagues, hail, locusts, and darkness, often linked by scholars to a single, powerful, and distant natural phenomenon, a major volcanic eruption. The most compelling candidate for such an event is the cataclysmic eruption of the volcano on the island of Thera in the Aegean Sea. While the exact date of the Thera eruption is debated with radiocarbon dating, suggesting a range from 1620 to 1600 BCE. The biblical narrative states that every firstborn in the land of Egypt died, from the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sat on his throne, to the firstborn of the female servant who was behind the handmill, and all the firstborn of the livestock. This highly specific mortality pattern, targeting the firstborn, is difficult to explain by general disease, but it becomes plausible when considering the unique social structures and food storage practices of ancient Egypt, particularly in the context of contaminated grain. One prominent theory suggests that this plague was caused by a fungal toxin contaminating stored grain. Some scholars argue for a later date or acknowledge the potential for long-lasting atmospheric effects. A super-colossal eruption of this magnitude would have injected immense quantities of ash, dust, and sulfur dioxide into the upper atmosphere, circulating globally. Such an ash cloud could profoundly influence weather patterns far from the eruption site. The biblical hail, described as very heavy, such as has not been in Egypt since its foundation, could be explained by a significant disruption in atmospheric circulation caused by volcanic aerosols. Volcanic ash can serve as condensation nuclei, promoting intense precipitation, sometimes mixed with ash, which could appear as fire mingled with the hail. The locusts might follow if the ash fallout temporarily fertilized the land, causing a surge in vegetation, which combined with altered weather patterns could lead to ideal breeding conditions for locust swarms. Finally, the darkness, described as a darkness that can be felt, lasting for 3 days, is a classic effect of a dense volcanic ash cloud blocking out the sun. Such an event would have been terrifying and absolute, plunging the land into an unnatural gloom. While the precise dating of Thera remains a challenge for a direct link to a traditional Exodus timeline, it undeniably offers a powerful natural explanation for environmental disasters of biblical proportion, demonstrating how seemingly supernatural events could have deep roots in geology and climate. The climactic and most devastating of the plagues, the death of the firstborn, also lends itself to a compelling naturalistic explanation, one that ties directly into the preceding ecological chaos. In the wake of the hail, which would have damaged crops, and the locusts, which devoured what remained, any salvaged grain would have been left damp and vulnerable to infestation by fungi, especially in the warm, humid conditions of Egypt. certain molds, like Aspergillus flavus. The walls of water described in the Bible could be the raised water levels on either side of this exposed land, or simply the perception of the water receding dramatically. The biblical narrative then states that when the Egyptian army pursued, the wind either ceased or shifted, allowing the water to rush back in and engulf them. This phenomenon, while rare on such a dramatic scale, is a scientifically documented occurrence in shallow water bodies worldwide. It is a natural event that, in the context of the Israelites' desperate escape and their belief in divine intervention, would have been interpreted as an undeniable and spectacular miracle, providing a compelling scientific explanation for the parting of the sea and illustrating how natural forces can be reinterpreted through a theological lens, becoming foundational narratives for generations. Why the firstborn? In many ancient cultures, and quite plausibly in Egypt, the firstborn son held a privileged status, often being given preferential access to the best food, or perhaps consuming a larger portion of the initial harvest. In times of scarcity and contamination, this preferential access could paradoxically lead to a higher exposure to toxins. Alternatively, if the plague was caused by rodent-borne diseases, the firstborn might have been more susceptible due to their position in the household, perhaps sleeping closer to the communal grain stores, or simply due to a higher intake of contaminated food or water. This theory links the biological explanation for plagues directly to food supply chain disruptions and cultural practices, providing a horrifyingly plausible natural mechanism for the most dreadful of the plagues, and aligning it directly with the prior sequence of environmental catastrophes. The biblical account describes a strong east wind that blows all night, dividing the waters and creating a dry path for the Israelites, with walls of water on either side. This incredible phenomenon, while seemingly defying natural laws, can be explained by a rare but documented meteorological event known as wind set-down. This occurs when a strong, sustained wind blowing in a specific direction over a relatively shallow body of water pushes the water away, temporarily exposing the seabed. The geographical location is crucial here. While the traditional Red Sea is too deep for this to occur, scholars have proposed alternative locations for the Yam Suf that fit the bill. These include shallow lagoons along the Mediterranean coast, such as Lake Bardawil, or shallow lakes and marshlands within the eastern Nile Delta region itself. In such a shallow body of water, a powerful, sustained east wind blowing all night could indeed push the water to the western side, temporarily exposing a dry land bridge for several hours. In synthesizing these various naturalistic explanations for the plagues and the parting of the sea, a powerful pattern emerges. Rather than a series of disconnected, randomly supernatural events, we can envision a cascading chain of environmental and biological disasters, potentially triggered by a combination of regional climate anomalies and a distant geological event. The Nile turning red, frogs fleeing, insect swarms, disease outbreaks, extreme weather, and the final, targeted biological catastrophe, culminating in a dramatic, wind-driven sea event, all form a plausible, albeit devastating. Then how did Israel as a distinct people actually emerge in Canaan? Modern scholarship, grappling with the archaeological silence discussed in Part 3, has moved beyond the literal conquest model to propose several compelling alternative theories for Israel's origins. The most widely accepted and archaeologically supported of these is the infiltration or emergence model. This theory posits that the early Israelites were not a unified, invading force from outside Canaan, but rather emerged gradually from within the indigenous population of Canaan itself. It suggests a slow process of semi-nomadic groups, perhaps including some of the Apur, moving into the sparsely populated, less controlled central highlands of Canaan during the Late Bronze Age and Early Iron Age. The key lies in understanding the interpretation of these events by the affected population. For a people experiencing such unprecedented devastation and desperation, especially a group already believing in a powerful deity, these events would have been undeniably understood as a direct, divinely orchestrated judgment, a clear manifestation of God's power and His intervention on their behalf. The power of storytelling, particularly in ancient oral cultures, lies in its ability to amplify, condense, and theologize natural phenomena, transforming a series of ecological crises into a coherent narrative of divine purpose. This interpretation doesn't diminish the spiritual or theological meaning of the Exodus for believers. Instead, it offers a framework for understanding how profound spiritual truths can be conveyed through narratives that are rooted, however distantly, in natural phenomena. It recognizes that God can work through the natural world. It allows for a historical core to the narrative, acknowledging the profound impact these events would have had, even if the literal scale and direct supernatural intervention are reinterpreted. This perspective helps bridge the gap between faith and scientific inquiry, offering a richer, more nuanced understanding of the natural phenomena in biblical narratives. Having explored naturalistic explanations for the plagues, we now turn to an even more fundamental question. If the traditional mass exodus and conquest narrative is not supported by the evidence, these groups, who would eventually coalesce into what we identify as Israelites, were likely pastoralists or agriculturalists who sought refuge from the political instability and oppressive city-state systems of the Canaanite lowlands. They shared common linguistic and cultural elements with their Canaanite neighbors, but slowly began to form a distinct identity, often by differentiating themselves from the dominant lowland Canaanite culture and its polytheistic religious practices. The archaeological evidence, which shows the growth of numerous small, unfortified villages in the highlands, often on previously unsettled land, strongly supports this model, and seek refuge and autonomy in the less controlled, higher ground of the Central Highlands, where they established their new, independent villages. In this model, the unifying force would have been a shared ideology of liberation and a nascent monotheistic faith that rejected the polytheistic and oppressive systems of the Canaanite kings. The archaeological evidence for simple, unfortified highland villages with a more egalitarian layout would fit this model well. While the peasant revolt model faces challenges, it remains an important historical idea that shifts the focus from external invasion to internal social dynamics as the driving force behind Israel's formation, offering a compelling sociological theory for Israelite origins and contributing to the understanding of early Israelite society. These early settlements exhibit cultural continuity with local Canaanite material culture, rather than a sudden break or the introduction of a completely foreign culture. This model accounts for the lack of destruction layers attributable to a unified invasion and the gradual indigenous nature of early Israelite settlement, painting a picture of Israel's gradual emergence from within Canaanite society a stark contrast to the traditional invasion narrative, offering a more scientifically grounded account of ancient Israel's origins. A second alternative theory for Israel's origins, though less favored in current scholarship than the infiltration emergence model, is the peasant revolt model. This theory, first proposed by George Mendenhall and later developed by Norman Gottwald, suggests that early Israel emerged not through an external invasion, but through a process of internal social and economic unrest within Canaanite society itself. It posits that the population of early Israel largely consisted of disaffected Canaanite peasants, serfs, and laborers who had been oppressed by the harsh feudal system of the Canaanite city-states. These impoverished and disenfranchised groups, perhaps joined by marginalized elements like the Apiru, revolted against their urban overlords, seeking freedom and a new, more egalitarian social order. This revolt would have led them to abandon the lowland city-states, while the infiltration, emergence model, and peasant revolt model provide compelling alternatives for the majority of early Israel's population. Some scholars acknowledge the enduring power of the Exodus narrative and propose that there might be a smaller, historical kernel to the story. This small-scale Exodus, or early Exodus, model suggests that a smaller group of Semites did indeed escape from forced labor in Egypt. Instead, they would have merged with the existing Canaanite populations, or, more likely, joined the already emerging Israelite communities in the highlands that formed through the infiltration or peasant revolt processes. Their powerful, traumatic memory of escape from Egyptian bondage and their unique worship of Yahweh would have been so compelling that it eventually became the foundational myth for the entire burgeoning Israelite people. In this scenario, their story of liberation, amplified and elaborated over centuries of oral tradition, would be adopted as the collective history of all the diverse groups that coalesced into Israel. This model allows for some historical reality to the Exodus, but scaled down drastically from the biblical account, making it far more archaeologically plausible. It provides a bridge between the biblical narrative and the archaeological record, suggesting a powerful story born from real, albeit smaller-scale, experiences, offering a fascinating perspective on the small-scale Exodus hypothesis. This group might have been slaves associated with specific projects, perhaps at sites like Avaris, Pyramuses, who managed to flee. This smaller contingent having experienced actual Egyptian bondage, and perhaps encountered a distinct deity in the wilderness, potentially through groups like the Midianites or Kenites, leading to the Kenite hypothesis for the origin of Yahwism, would then have made their way to Canaan. Upon arriving in Canaan, this relatively small group would not have constituted a conquering army of millions. In concluding this exploration of natural explanations and alternative origins, it becomes clear that while there may be no single smoking gun alternative theory that definitively replaces the biblical narrative, there is a powerful convergence of plausible explanations that align far better with the archaeological and historical data we possess. The consistent archaeological silence regarding a mass exodus and a unified conquest, coupled with the ability to explain many of the dramatic plagues as interconnected natural phenomena, necessitates a revaluation of the traditional literal interpretation. These alternative theories for Israel's emergence in QAnon, whether through gradual infiltration, internal peasant revolt, or a small-scale exodus that later became a foundational mythal, provide more historically grounded pathways for the formation of the Israelite people. They acknowledge the powerful memory of oppression and the eventual emergence of a distinct people, which is undeniable. Ultimately, understanding the Exodus and Israel's origins through these nuanced lenses does not diminish the story's profound power or its enduring theological significance for millions. Instead, it offers a richer, more complex appreciation of how ancient societies forged their identity and conveyed their deepest truths through narratives that blended historical kernels with profound spiritual meaning. The biblical Exodus narrative, even if not a literal historical account of a mass migration, remains a powerful testament to the themes of liberation, divine intervention, and the birth of a nation. It continues to inspire hope and shape identity for countless individuals across generations. This perspective challenges us to engage with sacred texts with intellectual honesty, seeking truth in all its forms. Having considered what might have happened, our next step is to explore how this incredibly powerful narrative itself was born, developed, and transformed over centuries. Join us for Part 5 as we delve into the birth of a narrative, how the story evolved, shifting our focus from the events themselves to the profound process of their creation and transmission, a key aspect of biblical narrative evolution and its enduring legacy. In our continuing quest to uncover the unromantic truth of the biblical Exodus, we have in previous segments critically examined the biblical narrative. Itself explored the historical landscape of ancient Egypt and confronted the profound archaeological science in the Sinai and Canaan. We then ventured into the realm of naturalistic explanations for the plagues and discussed compelling alternative theories for the emergence of Israel before widespread literacy. Stories were primarily passed down by word of mouth, recited, sung, and reenacted across generations. In this dynamic environment, narratives are not static, fixed accounts. They are living entities, constantly adapting, expanding, and being reshaped to resonate with the audience of the moment. A community's shared experiences, whether of foreign oppression, famine, migration, or a dramatic escape, would naturally become enshrined in its collective memory. It is highly plausible that various smaller-scale historical kernels, such as groups of Semites fleeing difficult conditions in Egypt, or localized environmental disasters interpreted as divine judgment, could have been preserved in such collective memory. Theories that align far better with the available historical and archaeological evidence than a literal mass exodus and conquest. Now, having established what the external evidence does not support, our journey takes a fascinating and crucial turn. We shift our focus from the events themselves to the remarkable process by which the story of the Exodus, as we know it, came into being. This is a journey into the heart of narrative evolution, exploring how collective memory, oral traditions, and the powerful theological insights of ancient Israel transformed scattered kernels of experience into the cohesive, epic narrative found in the Bible. Understanding the development of the Exodus story means recognizing that ancient texts, especially those as foundational as the Torah, are rarely the product of a single author writing at a single moment in time. Instead, they are often the result of centuries of oral transmission, compilation, and redactional layered process, where different traditions, perspectives, and theological interpretations are woven together. Imagine a grand tapestry where threads of different colors and textures are skillfully combined by various artisans over generations. The Exodus narrative with its intricate details and powerful symbolism, is precisely such a tapestry. Its evolution reflects the changing needs, experiences, and theological understandings of the Israelite people throughout their long history. This segment will explore the various stages and influences that shaped this incredible story, from its earliest oral forms to its final written compilation, offering a comprehensive look at the biblical narrative evolution and its profound impact on subsequent generations, particularly for our American audience interested in the origins of sacred texts. At the very foundation of the Exodus narrative, development lies the immense power and fluidity of oral tradition and collective memory in the ancient Near East. Over time, these fragments of memory would have been retold, embellished, and combined. Each retelling would serve to strengthen the community's identity and their understanding of their place in the world. A memory of slavery in Egypt and a subsequent escape would be particularly potent, forming a foundational trauma and liberation narrative. This process of remembering and retelling ensures that even if the specific historical details were generalized or amplified, the core experience of oppression and deliverance remained central. The very human need to make sense of suffering and to articulate a common origin story ensures that such narratives, even if rooted in small-scale events, gain immense cultural significance and grow in scope and detail, becoming the bedrock of a people's self-understanding. This concept of collective memory in ancient societies is vital for understanding the origins of the Exodus story. As these oral traditions solidified, certain recurring themes and proto-Israelite stories would have begun to take shape, predating the full, detailed Exodus narrative we find in the Bible. Long before the fully formed story of Moses and the plagues, there were likely circulating memories of migration and promise. While not directly Israelites, the Apiru may represent a shared historical reality of groups susceptible to forced labor and seeking new lives. These early, fragmented memories, foreign sojourn, hardship, a movement to freedom, and the promise of a land would serve as the initial building blocks. They were the raw materials, the loose threads, which later generations of scribes and theologians would weave into the elaborate tapestry of the Exodus, imbuing it with layers of meaning and specific details that served their contemporary needs. This process of the development of proto-Israelite traditions highlights how a complex narrative can emerge from simpler, earlier experiences and themes. The ancestral narratives in Genesis, for instance, already speak of Abraham's journey to Canaan, the promise of land, and the covenant established with a specific deity. These themes lay crucial groundwork for a later story of return to a promised land. Furthermore, if a small-scale exodus of Semitic groups from Egyptian forced labor did occur, the specific memory of that oppression and that escape would have been a powerful, enduring memory for the descendants of those who experienced it. The broader phenomenon of the Apiru, a socio-economic class of marginalized, often stateless individuals found throughout the ancient Near East, also points to a pervasive experience of insecurity and vulnerability. The academic approach to understanding the layered nature of the Hebrew Bible, particularly the Pentateuch, is often informed by the documentary hypothesis. While this is a complex and highly debated theory, its core idea is that the Pentateuch was not written by a single author. It tends to depict God as more transcendent, often revealing himself through dreams, angels, or prophets. and emphasizes awe and fear of God. This context is crucial for understanding the emergence and influence of the Deuteronomist source. Scholars typically link the D source comprising most of the book of Deuteronomy and influencing the historical books from Joshua through Kings to the religious reforms of King Josiah in the southern kingdom of Judah in the late 7th century BCE. The Deuteronomistic theology places immense emphasis on the covenant between God and Israel, stressing themes of absolute obedience to God's law, the dangers of idolatry, and the centralization of worship in a single, legitimate sanctuary. These two sources would have possessed slightly different versions or emphases within the Exodus story, reflecting their distinct regional and theological perspectives. For instance, their accounts of the wilderness wanderings or the specific details of the covenant at Sinai might have varied. The initial stages of committing these oral traditions to writing likely involved these separate strands, each contributing unique elements to the unfolding saga of Israel's liberation, illustrating the early textual layers of the Exodus story and the fascinating process of its literary formation, but rather compiled from several distinct, identifiable sources that were originally independent narratives or traditions. Simplified, the most prominent of these sources relevant to the Exodus narrative are the Yahwist and Elohist. The J source, often identified by its use of the divine name Yahweh, is thought to originate primarily in the southern kingdom of Judah, perhaps as early as the 10th or 9th century BCE. It often depicts God in a more anthropomorphic way, walking and talking with humans, and emphasizes the covenant with Abraham. Its version of the Exodus might have focused on a more direct, miraculous, divine intervention. The E source, identified by its use of the divine name Elohim, is thought to originate in the northern kingdom of Israel, perhaps slightly later than J. As the Israelite kingdoms faced various challenges: political instability, internal strife, and the looming threat of powerful empires, the need for a unifying national narrative became increasingly pressing. The D source profoundly reshaped and amplified the Exodus narrative to serve these theological and political purposes. For the Deuteronomist, the Exodus became the foundational historical event, unequivocally demonstrating God's unique choice of Israel and justifying the importance of adhering to his laws. This source, thought to have been compiled primarily during or after the exile, reflects the concerns of the priestly class and furnishings, and the elaborate genealogies and census lists. While these details may seem mundane to a modern reader, for the exilic community and those returning to rebuild, they were vital for re-establishing a sense of identity, order, and divine presence after the destruction of the temple and the loss of the land. The P source made the Exodus the primary context for the establishment of Israel's entire cultic and legal system, providing a blueprint for how a holy people should live in the presence of a holy God. This layer, often the most formalized and detailed, ensures the Exodus narrative solidified its role, not just as a historical memory, but as the bedrock for Israel's unique religious identity, highlighting the priestly source's influence on the Exodus story as a foundational narrative for the entire religious and legal system of Israel. Focusing heavily on ritual purity, sacrificial laws, the establishment of the priesthood, and the meticulous details of the tabernacle and its worship. For the priestly writers, the Exodus was not just a liberation from slavery. It was the divine act that established Israel as a holy people, set apart by their unique cultic practices and their direct access to God's presence through sacred ritual. The Peace Source adds immense detail and grandeur to the narrative, particularly concerning the plagues, emphasizing God's overwhelming power and judgment against Egypt. The wilderness period, in particular, becomes a time of testing and instruction, where God molds his rebellious people through strict commandments. The D Source introduces more elaborate speeches, warnings, and promises into the narrative, transforming the Exodus from a miraculous escape into a grand national epic that serves as the moral and theological bedrock for the entire nation. It solidifies the idea that Israel's prosperity in the land, or its eventual exiles, directly tied to its fidelity to the covenant established at Sinai, giving the Deuteronomistic theology a central role in shaping the perception of the Exodus as a definitive, formative event in Israel's history. Following the devastating experience of the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BCE, a new literary voice emerged that profoundly shaped the Exodus narrative. The priestly source, P's contribution, is evident in the precise instructions for the Passover ritual, the meticulous descriptions of the tabernacle's construction, the complexity of the Exodus narrative, as we find it in the Bible, becomes clearer when we understand the process of redaction, the sophisticated work of ancient editors who combined these various source texts into a single, cohesive narrative. It's crucial to remember that this wasn't a single editor working in isolation, but rather a long and complex literary process spanning centuries. This was a catastrophic period for the Judahites. The destruction of Jerusalem, the temple, and the monarchy, followed by the forced deportation of much of the population to Babylon. Faced with the annihilation of their national identity and religious institutions, the exiled community found solace, meaning, and hope by re-engaging with their past, particularly the Exodus narrative. In this desperate context, the Exodus story was powerfully reinterpreted and amplified, becoming a potent metaphor for liberation and return from exile. Just as God had delivered their ancestors from bondage in Egypt, so too would he deliver them from Babylon and lead them back to their promised land. The redactor's goal was to weave together these distinct traditions, often with their own unique emphases and stylistic nuances, to create a comprehensive national epic that spoke to the diverse experiences and theological understandings of the Israelite people. This process often involved careful selection, arrangement, and sometimes subtle modification of the existing source material to create a continuous flow. The evidence of this redactional process is apparent in the biblical text itself. Scholars often point to occasional repetitions in the narrative, slight inconsistencies in details, or shifts in divine names and literary style as seams where different sources have been joined. For instance, there are two distinct accounts of the giving of the law, and various repetitions in the plague accounts. These are not errors, but rather fingerprints of the meticulous, though sometimes imperfect, work of redactors. Rather than undermining the text's authority, understanding the Bible as a compiled text, reflecting different periods and concerns of ancient Israel, enriches its meaning. It reveals a living tradition that adapted and grew over time, offering a profound insight into the intellectual and theological engagement of ancient scribes with their sacred heritage. This understanding of biblical redaction helps explain the layered and composite nature of the Torah, a critical aspect for anyone studying ancient texts. one of the most profoundly impactful events that shaped and solidified the Exodus narrative in the collective consciousness of ancient Israel was the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BC.
The exile was not just a historical event, it was a profound theological crisis. How could God allow his chosen people to suffer such a fate? The Exodus narrative provided an answer. God is sovereign. It justifies their claims to the land of Canaan, not as a result of brute force, but as a divine. It serves as a foundational legal document for their society, with the Decalogue and the Mosaic Law given at Sinai being directly tied to their experience of liberation. In essence, the Exodus is a profound narrative of divine intervention in history, demonstrating God's justice, power, and faithfulness. It provides a blueprint for Israel's identity and purpose, offering guidance for how they should live as a redeemed people. This means that even if the literal historical details differ from the archaeological record, the story remains profoundly true in its meaning. It's theological, spiritual, and existential truth for billions, forming the bedrock of Israelite theology. He acts in history to redeem his people, and he is faithful to his covenant even when Israel fails. The memory of the first Exodus fueled the hope for a second Exodus, a future restoration. This reaffirmation of national identity and the yearning for future deliverance solidified the Exodus story as the absolute core Israelites' identity and theology. It became a prophecy of return, a blueprint for God's redemptive actions, and an enduring source of hope for future generations. The trauma of the exile, therefore, played an indispensable role in ensuring the Exodus narrative's survival. Prominent and profound theological weight in the biblical tradition, underscoring the impact of the Babylonian exile on Israelite identity. Beyond its potential historical kernels and its literary evolution, it is crucial to recognize that the Exodus narrative, as presented in the Bible, is primarily a theological statement. Its deepest purpose is not to provide a verifiable historical record in the modern sense, but rather to articulate fundamental truths about God, his character, and his relationship with Israel. The core message is clear. God is a liberator who hears the cries of the oppressed. He is faithful to his promises, particularly the promises made to Abraham about land and descendants. He is powerful, able to defeat the greatest empire of the ancient world. And through this act of liberation, he establishes a unique covenant with Israel, providing them with laws and a path to holiness, making them his chosen people. The Exodus narrative explains Israel's very existence, their unique identity, and their special relationship with Yahweh.
To fully appreciate the Exodus narrative without becoming mired in historical debates, it is essential to distinguish between different forms of truth: historical fact, collective memory, and myth. A historical fact is verifiable through empirical evidence. Collective memory, as discussed, is a community's shared recollection of its past, which can be shaped by trauma, aspiration, and the passage of time. A myth, in the context of academic religious studies, is not a falsehood, but a foundational story that conveys deep truths about a people's identity, their purpose, their values, and their relationship to the divine. Myths explain why things are the way they are, providing meaning and orientation in the world. The Exodus, from this perspective, functions as a powerful myth of origin for ancient Israel. It provides a coherent, compelling account of how they came to be a distinct people, chosen by God, liberated from bondage, and given a divine mandate. It explains their laws, their land, and their unique covenant relationship. This doesn't mean it's necessarily a literal blow-by-blow historical account, but it means it is profoundly true in its ability to articulate the core beliefs and experiences of the Israelite people. just as a nation's founding narrative might contain elements of idealization or simplification. The Exodus story serves as a powerfully condensed and theologized narrative that grounds Israel's identity. It tells a different kind of truth, theological, existential, and formative one, which can be equally, if not more, impactful than empirical historical data, revealing the Exodus as a foundational myth. The Exodus story served a multitude of crucial purposes for ancient Israel, adapting and resonating differently throughout various periods of their history. Primarily, it was the ultimate narrative for identity formation. We are Israel, the people whom God delivered from slavery. This singular event forged their collective identity and set them apart from all other nations. Secondly, it provided the essential justification for their claim to the land of Canaan. The land was not simply conquered, it was a divine gift promised to their ancestors and secured through God's powerful act of liberation from Egypt. This narrative legitimized their presence and sovereignty in the territory. Thirdly, the Exodus served as the fundamental basis for the law. The Decalogue and the intricate legal codes given at Sinai were directly linked to the experience of liberation, emphasizing that freedom came with the responsibility of obedience to God's covenant. Furthermore, the Exodus was a perennial source of hope for the future. In times of oppression, defeat, or exile, the memory of the Exodus provided assurance that God, who had delivered them once, would surely deliver them again. It is not simply a historical record frozen in time, but a dynamic, multi-layered creation that grew from kernels of collective memory, shaped and refined over centuries by generations of storytellers, scribes, and theologians. By acknowledging the various layers and purposes of the Exodus narrative, we can approach it with intellectual honesty, recognizing its enduring theological and cultural significance, while also respecting the findings of modern scholarship. This journey into the unromantic truth does not seek to invalidate faith, but rather to illuminate the historical and literary processes behind one of humanity's most compelling narratives. Our journey is nearly complete. In our final segment, we will bring together all these threads, exploring how these findings impact modern belief, the broader cultural legacy of the Exodus, and the vital importance of reconciling faith with fact in our understanding of the ancient world. Join us for the conclusion of Shattering the Myth as we tackle the complexities of reconciling faith and fact in biblical history. The oral traditions, distinct literary sources, and the crucial experience of the Babylonian exile all contributed to its intricate tapestry, reflecting the evolving needs, theological insights, and historical circumstances of ancient Israel. Understanding this process of narrative evolution, from fragmented memories to a grand, compiled epic, enhances rather than detracts from the story's profound power. It allows us to appreciate the ingenuity and spiritual depth of those who crafted it. It became a template for God's redemptive activity in history. The story was constantly reinterpreted and retold to address the contemporary needs and challenges of the community. Whether celebrating deliverance, lamenting disobedience, or anticipating future restoration, its enduring power lies in this adaptability and its capacity to speak to universal themes of freedom, justice, and the relationship between humanity and the divine. This profound, multifaceted utility makes the purpose of the Exodus story for ancient Israel central to understanding its enduring legacy and its continued relevance. In synthesizing our exploration of how the Exodus narrative evolved, we gain a far richer and more nuanced understanding of this foundational story. This understanding also allows us to move beyond the limitations of a purely literal historical interpretation, which often clashes with archaeological and external historical data. Throughout this expansive series, Shattering the Myth, the Unromantic Truth of the Biblical Exodus, we have embarked on a comprehensive and often challenging intellectual journey. We began by deconstructing the powerful biblical narrative itself, examining its internal consistencies and literary nuances. From there, we ventured into the formidable empire of ancient Egypt, exploring its meticulous record-keeping, the naturalistic explanations for the plagues, and the alternative theories for Israel's origins can be unsettling, even challenging to deeply held beliefs. This often stems from a tension between the methodologies of scientific and historical inquiry, which prioritize empirical evidence and critical analysis, and certain fundamentalist or literalist approaches to Scripture, which assert the inerrancy and historical accuracy of every biblical detail. It's crucial to understand that the Bible is read in a multitude of ways, as literal history, as allegory, as theological truth, as wisdom literature, as poetry, and more. No single approach exhausts its meaning or purpose, and sophisticated administration only to discover a profound historical silence regarding the grand events of the Exodus. Our exploration then took us across the archaeological landscapes of the Sinai and Canaan, revealing a consistent lack of evidence for a mass migration and a unified conquest. We have also considered compelling naturalistic explanations for the biblical plagues and delved into the leading scholarly theories for Israel's emergence, which propose more gradual internal processes. The cumulative weight of this evidence has led us to what we termed the unromantic truth, that the literal, large-scale biblical exodus, as traditionally understood, faces significant historical and archaeological challenges. Now, as we arrive at this concluding segment, the most critical question remains: how do we reconcile this historical and archaeological understanding with the profound faith and enduring cultural significance that the Exodus story holds for billions worldwide? For many, the Exodus is not merely a tale. It is the cornerstone of their belief system, a foundational narrative of divine intervention and miraculous liberation. Our aim throughout this series has never been to negate faith or dismiss the spiritual power of the story. Rather, it has been to illuminate the past through the most rigorous historical and scientific lenses available, demonstrating that intellectual honesty in engaging with evidence can paradoxically lead to a richer, deeper, and perhaps even more robust understanding of sacred texts and their enduring meaning. This final discussion will explore why these findings matter, not just for academics, but for believers and non-believers alike, offering a pathway for reconciling faith and historical inquiry. For many who have grown up with a literal understanding of the biblical text, the findings presented throughout this series, the absence of Egyptian records, the archaeological silence in the desert and Canaan, our exploration has simply sought to examine the Exodus narrative through the lens of modern historical and archaeological methodology. When engaging with ancient texts, intellectual honesty compels us to consider all available evidence. When the necessity of proving every detail of a miraculous event is removed, the deeper universal truths embedded within the narrative shine through with even greater brilliance. The Exodus, regardless of its precise historical circumstances, remains a timeless and powerful story of universal liberation. It speaks to the human yearning for freedom from all forms of oppression, whether physical, spiritual, social, or systemic. It is a narrative that transcends its ancient Near Eastern setting, applicable to struggles against injustice, tyranny, and personal bondage across cultures and centuries. This is not an attack on faith, nor an attempt to discredit the spiritual experiences of individuals or communities. Instead, it is an invitation to a deeper, more nuanced understanding of how ancient peoples understood and articulated their relationship with the divine and their place in the world. It encourages a shift from demanding that the past perfectly conform to modern expectations of scientific accuracy to appreciating the rich literary and theological complexity of sacred narratives. Understanding that there are different forms of truth, historical truth, and the profound truth of meaning and purpose is key to navigating this tension, a crucial step for addressing historical challenges to biblical narratives. Indeed, for many, moving beyond a purely literal interpretation of the Exodus does not diminish faith. On the contrary, it can often strengthen it, leading to a more mature and resilient spirituality. By understanding that God might work through natural processes, through the slow unfolding of human history, and through the complex dynamics of social change, rather than solely through external, sudden miracles, more sophisticated and perhaps more profound understanding of divine action emerges. It allows for a God who is immanent within creation and human experience, not just intervening from without. The Exodus story, even when viewed through a non-literal lens, maintains its enduring power as a paradigm of divine deliverance, a testament to hope, and a reminder that ultimate freedom is found in a relationship with the divine. This perspective allows faith to be robust and adaptable, finding deep meaning in narrative truth even when specific historical claims are reevaluated, making it easier for believers to approach faith and historical evidence simultaneously. Beyond its historical veracity, the Exodus narrative maintains an indisputable and central theological meaning that has shaped Judaism, Christianity, and, by extension, much of Western civilization. For Judaism, the Exodus is the foundational event, celebrated annually through Passover, which commemorates God's liberation of his people from slavery and the establishment of the covenant at Sinai. His unwavering faithfulness to his promises, his justice against oppressors, and his desire for a covenant relationship with humanity. Its archetypal themes of liberation from oppression, the struggle for justice, and the journey towards a promised land have resonated deeply across centuries and continents. From the African American civil rights movement, where figures like Martin Luther King, Jr. frequently invoked the imagery of Moses leading his people to freedom, to the anti-apartheid struggles in South Africa, where Nelson Mandela's journey often mirrored the Exodus narrative, the story has provided a potent framework for understanding and articulating resistance against injustice. It provides the basis for law, morality, and social justice within these traditions, inspiring countless individuals and movements to fight for the oppressed. This deep theological truth, which speaks to fundamental human experiences of bondage, yearning for freedom, and divine deliverance, transcends the need for strict historical verifiability. It exists on a different plane of meaning, operating as a sacred narrative that shapes worldview and purpose for billions, cementing the theological significance of the Exodus as one of the most powerful stories ever told irrespective of its literal historicity. It defines Jewish identity, affirming them as God's chosen people with a unique relationship and responsibility. For Christians, the Exodus is profoundly reinterpreted through the lens of Christ, who is seen as the new Moses and the Passover lamb, whose sacrifice brings liberation from sin and death. The journey to the Promised Land is understood as a metaphor for spiritual pilgrimage and ultimate salvation. The story, therefore, functions as a constant reminder of God's character, His redemptive power. The impact of the Exodus narrative extends far beyond religious circles, permeating global culture and serving as a powerful source of inspiration for countless freedom movements. It has inspired countless works of literature, from spirituals sung by enslaved people yearning for freedom, to epic poems, novels, and dramatic plays. Its imagery is woven into art, music, and popular culture, providing a universal vocabulary for understanding collective struggles and aspirations. Even in secular contexts, the Exodus serves as a powerful symbol of human resilience, the yearning for self-determination, and the triumph of the human spirit against overwhelming odds. This immense cultural impact of the Exodus story demonstrates that its power lies not solely in its historical veracity, but in its profound resonance with the universal human experience of seeking liberation and justice. Its narrative framework continues to shape our understanding of progress and freedom in societies worldwide, making it a truly timeless and universal tale. To approach the biblical text with scholarly integrity, it is essential to appreciate the Bible as ancient literature and history simultaneously, rather than imposing anachronistic modern expectations onto its pages. The biblical authors were not writing history in the way a modern historian would, relying on archival records, cross-referencing sources, and striving for empirical accuracy. The Bible contains historical kernels and reflects historical contexts, but it also contains poetry, law, wisdom, literature, and foundational narratives that operate on a different plane of truth. The story of Abraham, while not necessarily verifiable in every detail, carries profound truths about faith and covenant. Similarly, the Exodus, even if not a literal mass migration, conveys deep truths about God's liberating power and the formation of a chosen people. By recognizing the ancient literary and historical conventions at play, we can appreciate the Bible for what it is, a complex, divinely inspired collection of texts that speaks to humanity across millennia. A foundational text that uses narrative and symbolism to convey meaning, rather than striving for the kind of empirical accuracy expected of modern scientific research, a crucial aspect of biblical literary analysis. Their purpose was primarily theological, pedagogical, and they employed the literary conventions of their time, which often included narrative amplification, hyperbole for dramatic effect, and the shaping of events to convey a deeper divine message. For example, large numbers in ancient Near Eastern texts often served as literary devices to signify overwhelming power or countless blessings, rather than precise population counts. Understanding this allows us to move beyond a simplistic binary of true or false. This critical understanding of the Bible's historical and literary contexts is precisely the domain of critical scholarship. Far from attempting to disprove faith, the vast majority of archaeologists, historians, and biblical scholars who engage in this work are driven by a deep respect for the texts and a profound curiosity about the past. Their work is meticulous, involving decades of linguistic analysis, archaeological excavation, and comparative study of ancient Near Eastern cultures. Throughout this series, we have repeatedly highlighted the profound silence in Egyptian records and the consistent lack of archaeological traces in the Sinai and Canaan that would support a literal exodus and conquest. This isn't merely an absence of specific, direct evidence. It is a fundamental lack of any evidence where, given the biblical scale of millions of people and decades of activity, there should be overwhelming and undeniable archaeological and textual data. Such an event, a national catastrophe for Egypt and a foundational migration for Israel, would leave indelible marks on the historical record demographic shifts, economic disruptions, massive material culture, countless burial sites, and widespread destruction layers. Critical scholarship is a tool for deeper understanding, a method for grappling with the complexities of ancient texts and societies in a way that goes beyond surface-level readings. It seeks to uncover the layers of meaning, the historical circumstances, and the literary artistry that shaped these narratives. This academic inquiry is not about demolition, but about construction, building a more nuanced, informed, and intellectually robust understanding of the Bible and the world from which it emerged. It challenges simplistic assumptions and encourages a dialogue between faith and reason, enriching both. By embracing critical scholarship, individuals can move beyond the anxieties of historical proof and instead find new depths of meaning and relevance in stories that have nourished human spirits for thousands of years. It reveals the Bible as a living text, capable of yielding new insights through ongoing study and open inquiry, fostering a richer understanding of biblical scholarship and its methods. Let us briefly revisit the central challenge of the missing evidence argument. Ultimately, embracing the complexities and nuances of the Exodus narrative allows for a richer and more profound engagement with its enduring power. It challenges us to move beyond simplistic binary choices, either 100% literally true or 100% false, and instead appreciate the multiple layers of truth that can exist within a single story. It suggests that faith, rather than being fragile in the face of historical inquiry, can be made more robust when it is grounded in a deep understanding of context, literary forms, and the nuances of human experience. The journey through the unromantic truth of the Exodus is not about tearing down. It is about building a more sophisticated, well-informed appreciation for a story that has shaped civilizations. It reveals that the pursuit of truth, whether historical or spiritual, can lead to deeper and more fulfilling insights, encouraging a more profound understanding of the complexities of biblical interpretation. History itself is rarely simple. It is a complex interplay of forces, events, and interpretations. Scholarly debate continues to flourish, with new theories emerging and existing ones being refined in light of fresh evidence. Every new inscription uncovered in Egypt or Canaan, every new layer excavated at an ancient site, and every new interpretation of a textual nuance contributes to our ever-evolving understanding of ancient Israel and its foundational narratives. This is the exciting frontier of Exodus scholarship, a field where the conversation is never truly finished, but is continually refined, deepened, and challenged. The Exodus narrative, understood as a layered literary and theological masterpiece built on kernels of historical memory, becomes even more fascinating. Its beauty is enhanced by understanding the intricate processes by which it came into being. reflecting the human struggle for meaning and identity in the face of both hardship and divine mystery. This approach encourages intellectual curiosity, open-mindedness, and a willingness to grapple with challenging information. The exploration of the Exodus is a dynamic and ongoing field of study, continually shaped by new archaeological discoveries, advances in linguistic analysis, and evolving historical methodologies. For those who seek to understand the Bible and ancient history, this ongoing research offers a compelling journey of discovery. It underscores the importance of critical thinking, of questioning assumptions, and of remaining open to new information, even when it challenges deeply held perspectives. The unromantic truth we have uncovered is not a lesser truth, but a differently powerful one. It is a truth that acknowledges the profound archaeological silence and historical complexities, while simultaneously affirming the enduring theological and cultural significance of the Exodus narrative. For some, this understanding may lead to a more robust and intellectually grounded faith. For others, it may provide a clearer historical picture of how a people forged its identity through compelling narrative. The pursuit of truth in all its forms is a continuous endeavor, and spirituality, a timeless testament to the yearning for liberation, the power of divine providence, and the enduring human spirit. It is a narrative that continues to inspire hope, challenge injustice, and shape the collective consciousness of humanity. As we close this series, we invite you, our audience, to continue questioning, exploring, and learning. May the pursuit of truth always illuminate your path, revealing the richness and depth hidden within the annals of history and the sacred texts that continue to shape our world. Thank you for joining us on History for the Tired, where we strive to bring the past to life with clarity and insight, reminding you of the enduring legacy of the Exodus story and its powerful resonance throughout human history. And the story of the Exodus stands as a testament to the enduring power of both faith and inquiry. Its layers of meaning, its historical echoes, and its profound spiritual resonance will continue to captivate and challenge generations to come, underscoring the vital nature of ongoing biblical research. In conclusion, our journey through Shattering the Myth, the unromantic truth of the biblical Exodus, has sought to provide an honest, evidence-based look at one of the most powerful stories in human history. The Exodus story, in all its nuanced complexity, remains a cornerstone of human culture,